Fort Benning changed everything for me, though not in the way anyone expects when they sign up to serve their country. 6 months ago, I was just another recruit fresh off the bus, 19 and convinced I knew what hard work meant from helping my dad run his construction business since middle school. Basic training would break us down and build us back up, they said. Make us into soldiers, into something stronger than we were before. What they never mentioned was that sometimes the breaking down goes too far, and sometimes the people doing it aren't following any rule book except their own twisted version. I still wake up some nights, drenched in sweat, remembering the sound of boots on concrete at 2 in the morning, knowing what was coming next. Sergeant First Class Hartley had been at Fort Benning for 12 years when our unit arrived that September. Square jaw, perfect posture, the kind of guy whose uniform looked like it had been painted on. Never a thread out of place even after 18-hour training days. Everyone respected him immediately, the way you respect someone who clearly knows their job inside and out, and could probably run the obstacle course backwards with their eyes closed. During regular training hours, he was tough but fair, pushing us hard, but always within the boundaries of what the training manual prescribed. He had this way of making you want to impress him, like getting a nod of approval from him meant you were really becoming a soldier. Other drill sergeants would joke around with him in the mess hall, and you could tell even they looked up to him, especially the younger ones who would ask his advice about handling difficult recruits. It started small, almost unnoticeable if you weren't paying attention. Private Kowalski dropped his rifle during morning drills, fumbled it right in front of the whole platoon, and Hartley's face went dark in a way I'd never seen before. Not the usual controlled anger drills sergeants use to motivate you, but something colder, more personal. That night, around 11 when most of us were already in our bunks, Hartley appeared in the doorway and called out Kowalski's name, told him to get dressed in full gear and report to the back training grounds behind Building 7. Nobody thought much of it at first. Extra PT for screw-ups was normal, expected even. But Kowalski came back 3 hours later, could barely walk, wouldn't look anyone in the eye, just collapsed into his bunk fully clothed and faced the wall. When someone asked him what happened, he just shook his head and said Hartley was helping him become better, that he needed the correction. After that first night, it became a pattern that spread through our barracks like a disease nobody wanted to name. If you messed up during the day, really messed up in a way that caught Hartley's attention, you could expect that late-night visit. The chosen recruit would get dressed in silence while the rest of us pretended to sleep, though every single one of us was wide awake, listening to the footsteps fade down the hallway. They'd come back hours later, some limping, some holding their ribs, all of them with that same hollow look in their eyes. We started calling them corrective sessions among ourselves, whispered conversations in the shower blocks where we figured the noise of running water would cover our voices. One kid from Alabama, Private Jennings, tried to refuse once, said he was going to report it to the battalion commander, but Hartley just smiled and reminded him that going outside the chain of command was a serious offense, and besides, who would believe a struggling recruit over a decorated sergeant with 12 years of spotless service? My turn came on a Wednesday in October, about 6 weeks into training. During live fire exercises, I'd hesitated before throwing a practice grenade, held it a second too long while my brain processed the weight of what I was doing, and Hartley saw everything. He didn't say anything at the time, just made a note on his clipboard, but I knew what was coming. Sure enough, at exactly midnight, I heard those boots coming down the hall, each step measured and deliberate like he was savoring the anticipation. When he appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim emergency lighting, he didn't even need to say my name. Just pointed at me and then at the door. I got dressed with numb fingers, laced my boots tight, and followed him out into the Georgia night where the air was thick with humidity, and the crickets had gone silent, like even they knew to be afraid. Building 7 sat at the edge of the base, an old warehouse they used for storing equipment that hadn't been updated since Vietnam. Behind it was a dirt clearing surrounded by tall pines that blocked any view from the main base. The ground worn smooth from what I now realized were years of these sessions. Hartley had me start with push-ups, nothing unusual there. except he made me do them with my feet elevated on a crate while he placed his boot on my back, adding pressure every time I went down until my arms were shaking so bad I could barely hold myself up. When I finally collapsed, face first into the dirt, he grabbed me by the collar and hauled me up, told me weakness like mine got soldiers killed, got whole units killed, and he was going to fix me whether I liked it or not. For the next 2 hours, he put me through exercises I'd never seen in any manual, making me hold stress positions until my muscles cramped and locked up, bear crawling through the dirt while he kicked at my ribs if I slowed down, standing at attention while he screamed questions in my face about why I thought I deserved to wear the uniform, when I couldn't even throw a grenade properly. The worst part wasn't even the physical pain, though that was bad enough that I threw up twice and he made me keep going anyway, told me to swallow it down like a real soldier. It was the way he knew exactly how far to push without leaving marks that would raise questions during morning PT. A bruised rib here, a strained muscle there, nothing that wouldn't look like normal training injuries to anyone who didn't know better. He had it down to a science, probably perfected over years of doing this to recruits who thought they had nowhere else to turn. When he finally let me go, he grabbed my face with one hand, fingers digging into my jaw, and told me this was between us, that I should be grateful he cared enough to give me personal attention when most sergeants would just let me fail. Then he mentioned almost casually that Private Thompson from the previous training cycle had tried to file a complaint once, and wasn't it sad how he'd had that training accident that got him medically discharged before he could graduate. 3 days later, everything changed when Private Nguyen collapsed during one of Hartley's sessions and didn't get back up. We found out later from a guy who worked in medical that Nguyen had suffered kidney damage from dehydration and repeated blunt force trauma to his lower back, though the official report just said heat exhaustion and overexertion during voluntary additional training. They medevaced him out that same night, and by morning his bunk had been stripped and his name removed from all the rosters like he'd never existed. But that's when we started talking to each other for real, comparing notes in hushed conversations during equipment cleaning, and realized this had been going on for years. One recruit remembered his older brother mentioning something about a crazy sergeant at Benning who did special training back in 2016. Another had heard rumors from guys in different units about avoiding Hartley's attention at all costs. What really made my gut churn was when Private Foster, who had a cousin working admin at battalion headquarters, told us what he'd learned during a family day visit. Apparently, Hartley wasn't acting alone, and that was the scariest part of all. There were at least 3 senior officers who knew exactly what was happening behind Building 7, including Major Brennan and Lieutenant Colonel Walsh, and they'd been rotating Hartley between training companies every few years to avoid too many complaints building up in one place. Foster's cousin had seen requisitions for medical supplies that went specifically to Building 7, off-the-book stuff that never appeared in any official inventory, bandages and ice packs and prescription painkillers that Hartley would use to patch up recruits just enough to make it through the next day's training. They had a whole system in place, documented in folders that weren't supposed to exist, tracking which recruits had been through sessions and making sure none of them ended up in the same unit after graduation where they might compare stories. We tried to be smart about it, gathered evidence where we could, took photos of bruises in the latrine mirrors using a contraband phone someone had hidden in the ventilation grate. Private Coleman started writing down dates and times in a notebook he kept inside his pillowcase, documenting who got called out and what condition they came back in. But they were watching us too, and I think Hartley could smell the rebellion brewing in our unit like blood in the water. He started calling multiple recruits at once for sessions, making us watch each other go through the exercises, forcing us to hold each other down or add weight to the stress positions, turning us against ourselves so we couldn't unite against him. One night he had 5 of us out there, and when Private Reese refused to put his knee on Private Gordon's back during push-ups, Hartley made all of us low crawl through the mud for an hour until Reese finally broke and did what he was told, crying the whole time while Gordon gasped underneath him. The breaking point came during week 9 when Private Foster, the one whose cousin worked in admin, decided he'd had enough and went straight to the Criminal Investigation Division office on base. He walked in there with Coleman's notebook, the phone with all our photos, and bruises still fresh on his ribs from the night before. 6 hours later, Foster was gone, transferred to another base for family emergency reasons, and Hartley called a special formation just for our barracks. He stood there in front of us, hands clasped behind his back, and talked about how training accidents were such unfortunate things, how sometimes recruits who couldn't handle the pressure made up stories to avoid facing their own failures. He never mentioned Foster by name, but he didn't have to. We all knew what had happened. That night, nobody got called for a session, but nobody slept either. Just lay there in the dark wondering if we'd ever make it to graduation, or if we'd all end up mysteriously transferred or medically discharged before we could tell anyone what really went on behind Building 7. But Foster had been smarter than any of us realized, because before he went to CID, he'd mailed copies of everything to his father, a retired command sergeant major, who still had connections all the way up the chain. 2 weeks later, the base was suddenly crawling with investigators from outside Fort Benning. People Hartley and his protectors couldn't control or intimidate. They pulled each of us in for interviews one by one, and this time when we talked, people actually listened and wrote things down in official reports that couldn't just disappear. Hartley was relieved of duty pending investigation, and watching him walk off base in civilian clothes instead of his pristine uniform was like watching a demon lose its power. Major Brennan retired quietly a month later. Walsh got transferred to a desk job in Pentagon, where he couldn't hurt anyone, and 3 other sergeants we didn't even know were involved got brought up on charges. The investigation found 17 years' worth of incidents, hundreds of recruits who'd been through those sessions, dozens who'd been seriously injured and silenced. Some of them came forward after hearing about the investigation, guys who were now stationed all over the world but still woke up in cold sweats remembering Building 7. They gave us all medical evaluations and psych assessments, and I spent 6 months in therapy learning how to sleep through the night again without hearing those boots in the hallway. I finished my training with a different unit, became a soldier the right way, the way it was supposed to happen all along. But I still can't walk past a building like that warehouse without feeling my chest get tight and my palms start to sweat, wondering who else is out there using their authority to break people down with nobody watching, nobody stopping them until someone finally finds the courage to speak up. "40 pounds of medical supplies on my back, and I still didn't have enough bandages for what was coming. Forward operating base. Ridgeline had been my home for almost a month, carved into the mountainside like a concrete tumor overlooking 3 villages that hadn't asked for our help. Command called it a humanitarian stabilization effort, which sounded noble enough when you're sitting in an air-conditioned briefing room stateside. Up here, at 8,000 feet, where the wind could strip paint off vehicles and the locals watched us through cracked windows, those words meant something else entirely. 2 years out of medical training at Fort Campbell, and here I was, 24 and playing combat medic in a place where combat was supposedly over. My friends from high school were posting pictures of their new apartments and complaining about their bosses on social media. My boss carried an M4 and had a habit of reviewing casualty reports while cleaning his sidearm. Captain Morrison ran our unit like clockwork, which should have been reassuring but wasn't. Every morning, briefing followed the same script: hearts and minds, building trust, showing the locals we were here to help. He'd stand there with his clipboard, marking off daily objectives like we were running a grocery store instead of an armed outpost. My medical station was supposed to be the crown jewel of our presence here, proof that we brought healing instead of harm. Those first few weeks I actually believed it. Treated mostly respiratory infections in kids whose lungs couldn't handle the dust we kicked up with our vehicles. Set broken bones for farmers who'd fallen working their terraced fields. Distributed antibiotics like candy on Halloween. Morrison would stop by every evening to review my patient logs, nodding approvingly at the numbers, always reminding me to document everything properly for the reports that went up the chain. Everything changed on a Tuesday night in my 4th week. I was organizing supplies, counting gauze packets for the 3rd time, because the numbers never seemed to match our requisitions, when I heard the commotion outside. 2 of our guys, Corporal Vance and Private Holloway, were hauling someone through the gates. At first, I thought it was one of ours, the way they were supporting him between them. But as they got closer to the medical station's lights, I saw it was a local man, maybe 40. His traditional clothes torn and stained with something dark. They dropped him on my examination table without a word, and Vance just said, "Fix him up, Doc," before walking out. That's when I got my first real look at his injuries. Ligature marks around his wrists, deep enough to leave grooves in the skin, bruising across his ribs in a pattern I recognized from textbooks but had never seen in person, the kind you get from systematic beating with something rigid in uniform, like a baton. The man wouldn't tell me his name, just kept repeating something in Pashto that I didn't understand, his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds like he expected someone to come finish what they'd started. His breathing was labored, but not from any respiratory condition. It was fear, pure and simple, the kind that makes your chest tight and your hands tremble. I cleaned and dressed his wounds, documented everything in my official log with the kind of neutral medical language that strips humanity from injury. Contusions, multiple sites, abrasions consistent with restraint, careful not to speculate about cause in writing. While I worked, I noticed other things. His fingernails had dirt packed beneath them like he'd been clawing at something, trying to dig his way out. There was a number written on the back of his hand in black marker, 47, like someone had been keeping track, organizing, systematizing whatever had happened to him. I gave him water and some pain medication, watched him drink with shaky hands that could barely hold the cup steady. After about an hour, when the morphine had taken the edge off his pain, he finally spoke a few words in broken English. "Not fighter," he said, pointing to himself. "Teacher. Just teacher." He pulled out a crumpled ID card from his pocket, the photo showing him clean-shaven and smiling, standing in front of a chalkboard covered in mathematical equations. The contrast between that photo and the broken man on my table made something twist in my gut. Before I could ask him anything else, Sergeant Brooks appeared in the doorway, told me the patient was cleared for release. When I protested that he needed observation, possible x-rays for the rib injuries, Brooks just looked at me with this flat expression and said, Morrison wanted him gone by dawn. The teacher understood enough English to know what that meant. He was on his feet and stumbling toward the door before I could even grab his arm to steady him. That should have been my first warning, the moment I should have started asking real questions, but I told myself it was an isolated incident. Maybe he'd been caught up in something, wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe our guys had made a mistake in the dark. You tell yourself these things because the alternative means accepting that everything you're doing here is a lie. But then Wednesday night came, and they brought in 3 more. Same kinds of injuries, same numbered hands, 48, 49, 50. One was a teenager, couldn't have been older than 16, with electrical burns on his shoulders that formed perfect circles, the kind you get from direct application of current through metal contacts. His uncle was with him, number 49, missing 2 fingernails and with a shoulder that hung wrong, dislocated and left untreated for hours. The third was an elderly woman who wouldn't stop crying, not from pain but from something else, something that had broken inside her that no amount of medical treatment could fix. I was wrapping the teenager's burns when Morrison himself walked into my station, something he rarely did after dark. He stood there watching me work, his hands clasped behind his back like he was inspecting troops on parade. These individuals were detained during routine security operations, he said, using that bureaucratic voice that turned people into paperwork. They've been processed and cleared. Your job is medical treatment, nothing more. I kept my eyes on the gauze I was wrapping, asked him what kind of security operation leaves electrical burns on a kid who probably wasn't even shaving yet. Morrison stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath, the gun oil on his uniform. Specialist, he said, and the way he said my rank made it sound like a threat. You're here to provide medical assistance. That's your lane. Stay in it." After he left, the teenager grabbed my wrist with his good hand, pulled me down close enough to whisper. His English was better than he'd let on in front of Morrison. "They come at night," he said, words tumbling out fast and desperate. "Take men from houses. Say we hide weapons, hide fighters. We hide nothing. My father, they took him 3 days ago. Number 31, he never came back. His uncle tried to shush him, terrified even in the relative safety of my medical station. But the kid kept talking. They have room in basement, under old school. They take us there, ask questions we cannot answer because we don't know. They write numbers so they know who talked, who didn't talk, who broke." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we didn't do things like that. But the evidence was right there under my hands, burned into his skin in perfect methodical circles. Thursday morning's briefing was like every other, Morrison going through his checklist while the squad leaders nodded along. I sat in the back, my coffee going cold in my hands, watching him discuss supply routes and patrol schedules like we hadn't been torturing civilians in the basement of an abandoned school. When he dismissed us, I followed him to his office, shut the door behind me. "Sir, about the patients coming in at night," I started, but he cut me off with a raised hand. "Those are enemy combatants who've been processed according to protocol," he said, not even looking up from his laptop. I told him about the teacher, the teenager, asked him how a math teacher qualified as an enemy combatant. That's when he finally looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my mouth go dry. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was calculation, like he was solving a problem, and I was a variable that wasn't fitting into his equation. "Specialist," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You're a good medic, one of the best we've had up here. Your reports are thorough, your treatment success rate is exceptional, but you're young. You don't understand the complexities of counterinsurgency operations." He pulled out a folder from his desk, thick with papers, and set it between us. "Every individual we detain is identified through intelligence gathering, phone intercepts, human intelligence, pattern analysis. That teacher you're so concerned about? His cousin's neighbor's son joined the militants 6 months ago. The teenager? His uncle's phone number was found in a dead fighter's contacts. These connections run deep, and sometimes we have to apply pressure to find where the threats are hiding." He tapped the folder with his index finger. "This is bigger than your medical station, bigger than this outpost. This is about preventing the next bombing in a marketplace full of families, the next ambush that kills 18-year-old privates from Kansas and Ohio." I left his office knowing 2 things. They weren't going to stop, and I was now a problem that needed solving. That night I couldn't sleep, kept thinking about the numbers, about how systematic it all was, how many people had passed through that basement before ending up on my table, or not ending up anywhere at all. Around 0200 hours, I heard vehicles leaving the base, the familiar rumble of Humvees heading down into the valley. I knew what that meant, knew that in a few hours I'd have more numbered hands to bandage, more electrical burns to treat, more broken people to patch up just enough so they could be broken again. I got up, started preparing my supplies, laying out everything I'd need for trauma treatment: gauze, antiseptic, morphine, suture kits. The routine of it was almost comforting, gave my hands something to do while my mind raced through options that all led to the same dead end. By 0400, they were back. This time it was 7 people, numbers 51 through 57, and among them was a kid who couldn't have been more than 12. Number 54. His crime, according to the processing sheet Corporal Vance dropped on my desk, was suspected courier activities. The boy had a concussion, pupils uneven, responding slowly to light, the kind of head trauma you get from being slammed against something hard, repeatedly. While I was checking him for skull fractures, Morrison appeared in the doorway again, but this time he wasn't alone. Master Sergeant Kane was with him, a man who never came to the medical station, who most of us only saw during major operations. Kane had been in Afghanistan since the beginning, had that 1,000-yard stare that comes from seeing too much and caring too little. Specialist, Morrison said, his voice different now, colder. "We need to discuss your recent performance evaluations." It was a threat dressed up as bureaucracy, and we all knew it. Kane just stood there, hand resting casually on his sidearm, like we were having a normal conversation at a normal hour with normal people instead of a room full of tortured civilians. "Your rotation ends in 6 days, Morrison continued, checking his watch like the time mattered. "You'll be on the convoy back to Bagram, then stateside for leave. I'm sure you're looking forward to seeing your family, getting back to normal life." The way he emphasized normal made it clear what he meant. Forget what you've seen, keep your mouth shut, move on. Kane shifted slightly, his hand still on his weapon, and I understood the message completely. They had 6 more days to decide if I was going to be a problem that required a more permanent solution. The 12-year-old on my table moaned, trying to sit up, and Morrison's eyes flicked to him briefly before returning to me. "Of course, convoy routes can be dangerous. IEDs, ambushes, sometimes people don't make it to Bagram." He let that hang in the air between us, the implicit threat as clear as the numbered hands I was treating. "Do your job, specialist. Treat the patients, file your reports, and in 6 days you go home. That's all you need to focus on." After they left, I finished treating the boy and the others, working in silence while my mind processed what had just happened. They were giving me an out, but it came with conditions. Complicity through silence. 6 days of patching up torture victims. 6 days of pretending not to know what those numbers meant. 6 days of being part of a machine that ground up innocent people and spit out intelligence that probably wasn't even real. The boy's uncle came to help him walk out, and as they left, the man looked back at me with eyes that held no hope, no expectation of justice, just the resigned acceptance of someone who knew this was how the world worked now. I wanted to tell him I was sorry, that this wasn't what we were supposed to be, but what good would that do? I kept my mouth shut, cleaned my station, filed my reports with the same sanitized language that turned atrocities into medical procedures. 6 days. I made it through those 6 days by shutting down everything inside me that knew right from wrong, by becoming exactly what Morrison needed me to be, a cog in his machine, silent and efficient. On the morning of day 7, I was on that convoy to Bagram, and 3 weeks later, I was home. I never reported what I saw, never filed complaints, never spoke up. The official records show a successful humanitarian mission, hearts and minds won, medical aid delivered to grateful civilians. Sometimes I Google the names of places near that outpost looking for news, for any sign of what happened after I left. But there's nothing. It's like it never happened at all, except for the numbers I still see when I close my eyes. 31, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51 through 57, and all the ones that came after that are probably still coming. "12 years in the Army, and I walked away right before making Staff Sergeant, something my old squad still doesn't understand. I let them think what they want, because the real reason isn't something I can explain over beers at the VFW. What happened in that village near the Guatemalan border in early 2018 changed everything about how I see the world. I was 30 then, stationed at a small outpost in southern Mexico as part of a joint task force nobody talks about anymore. We were there, unofficially, helping the Mexican army track cartel movements through the jungle highlands. Most days were boring as hell, sitting in humid tents, monitoring radio chatter, eating MREs that tasted like cardboard soaked in regret. The kind of assignment where you count mosquito bites for entertainment and argue about whether the local water would kill you faster than a bullet. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning when Lieutenant Crawford called 6 of us into the command tent. Intel had picked up unusual activity in a village about 8 miles north, a place the locals called Piedra Negra. Satellite footage showed armed men moving through at night, possibly using it as a way station for moving product north. Crawford wanted eyes on the ground before committing to any larger operation. Simple recon, he said, in and out, 12 hours max. Me, Specialist Miller. Private First Class Dobson, Corporal Ramirez, Sergeant First Class Briggs, and Staff Sergeant Norton would hike in after dark, set up observation posts, and radio back what we found. I remember joking with Miller about finally getting some action after weeks of swatting mosquitoes. If I could go back and grab myself by the shoulders, tell myself to fake sick, break my own leg, anything to avoid that patrol, I would. We left at 2100 hours, moving single file through the jungle with night vision that turned everything into shades of green static. Norton took point, then Briggs, me, Miller, Dobson, and Ramirez bringing up the rear. The humidity was like breathing through wet cloth, and every step squelched in the muddy undergrowth. About 2 hours in, we hit our first waypoint, a ridge overlooking the valley where Piedra Negra sat like a cluster of dark squares against darker forest. Norton hand-signaled for us to spread out and establish our observation posts. I set up with Miller behind a fallen tree trunk, its bark crawling with insects that glowed white in the night vision. Through my scope, I could see cooking fires in the village, maybe 15 structures total. Most of them simple concrete blocks with corrugated metal roofs. At 23:47 hours, Norton's voice crackled through the radio, saying he had movement on the north side of the village. Then Briggs confirmed, counting at least 12 individuals moving between buildings. I was adjusting my scope for a better view when the transmission cut into static. Not unusual in the mountains, but the timing made my neck prickle. Miller tried raising Norton on the backup frequency while I swept my scope across the village. The cooking fires were out now, and I couldn't spot any of the movement Norton had reported, just empty paths between dark buildings. Then Miller grabbed my shoulder, pointed to our 10 o'clock position. Through the trees, maybe 50 meters away, I saw them, 2 figures in tactical gear, moving low and fast toward Dobson's position. The way they moved, the equipment profile, these weren't cartel fighters. These were trained soldiers, and they were wearing our exact same kit. Miller and I exchanged looks through our night vision, that green-tinted moment of recognition that something was deeply wrong. I tried to raise Dobson on the radio, got nothing but dead air. The 2 figures had stopped now, taking cover behind trees, their weapons raised toward Dobson's position. I could see the distinctive outline of M4 carbines, the same weapons we carried. Miller tapped my shoulder twice, our signal for potential friendly fire situation. But these couldn't be friendlies. We were the only American unit operating in this sector, and the Mexican army used different gear entirely. I watched one of them pull something from their vest, and my gut clenched when I recognized the shape of a fragmentation grenade. Before I could key the radio to warn Dobson, the figure hurled it in a perfect arc toward his hide. The explosion lit up my night vision in a blinding white flash. Dobson's scream cut through the jungle for maybe 2 seconds before gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Not random cartel spray and pray, but controlled bursts, disciplined fire patterns I'd heard 1,000 times on the range. Miller was already returning fire while I tried desperately to reach anyone on the radio. Through the chaos, I heard Ramirez yelling in Spanish, then in English, then just screaming. More explosions, more muzzle flashes, but in the strobing light and shadow, I couldn't tell who was shooting at who. Miller pulled me down just as rounds cracked over our heads, splitting bark from the tree we'd been using for cover. I caught a glimpse of another figure sprinting between trees. Same height and build as Norton, same way of carrying his rifle, but Norton's position was 300 meters in the opposite direction. Then I heard Briggs's voice, clear as day, shouting, "Contact left!" Except Briggs's position had gone silent 5 minutes ago. Miller grabbed my vest and yanked me backward into a small depression in the ground, just as another grenade detonated where we'd been seconds before. Mud and vegetation rained down on us. In the ringing aftermath, I heard bootsteps, multiple sets, converging on our position from 3 sides. Miller was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, trying to clear his weapon that had jammed with mud. I peeked over the edge of our hole and saw them clearly for the first time. 6 figures in perfect formation, moving with textbook squad tactics. Under the night vision, I could make out unit patches on their shoulders, the same patches we wore. One turned slightly and I swear I was looking at Ramirez's face, except Ramirez was supposed to be 200 meters behind us. The figure raised his weapon toward our position, and I saw his finger move to the trigger. We ran. No tactical withdrawal, no covering fire, just pure panic-driven flight through the jungle. Branches tore at our gear. Roots sent us stumbling, but we kept moving because the alternative was dying in that green-tinted nightmare. Behind us, voices called out using our own call signs, our own tactical language, but with something wrong in the cadence, like an echo that arrives too soon. I could hear them pursuing, not crashing through the brush like we were, but moving with impossible coordination through terrain that should have slowed anyone down. Miller went down hard, his ankle catching in a root system. When I turned to help him up, he was staring past me with his mouth open. I followed his gaze and saw Norton standing 20 feet away, rifle at low ready. The problem was, I'd just heard Norton's voice on the radio 30 seconds ago, calling for backup from his original position a half-kilometer north. This, Norton smiled, and there was something in that expression that made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing. Miller scrambled to his feet and we bolted in different directions without a word. Some primal instinct telling us that staying together meant both dying. I ran for what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes, crashing through undergrowth, sliding down ravines, splashing through streams. Every shadow could have been one of them. Every sound might have been boots behind me. My radio kept crackling with fragments of conversation, my team members calling out positions, requesting support, confirming kills, but the voices overlapped wrong, like multiple people speaking with the same voice at the same time. At one point, I heard my own call sign repeated 3 times in my own voice even though I hadn't keyed the mic. I ripped the radio from my vest and threw it into the jungle. Better to be alone and silent than connected to whatever was happening on those frequencies. My compass was spinning wildly, the needle just rotating without stopping, so I navigated by keeping the slope of the mountain to my left, figuring it would lead me back toward our base eventually. Dawn was breaking when I literally stumbled into a Mexican army patrol near a logging road. I must have looked insane, covered in mud, gear torn, eyes wild, babbling in broken Spanish about American soldiers shooting at American soldiers. They zip-tied my hands at first, thought I might be a deserter or worse. It took 3 hours and a call to our liaison officer before they agreed to drive me back to our outpost. During that ride, bouncing in the back of their truck, I kept checking the faces of the Mexican soldiers, making sure they stayed the same people, that their features didn't shift when I looked away. When we reached the base, Lieutenant Crawford was waiting with 2 MPs. His first question wasn't about the mission or the village. He asked, very specifically, if I had seen any other members of my team return. When I said no, his jaw tightened in a way that told me I wasn't the first survivor to make it back. They put me in isolation for 48 hours. Standard procedure, they said, for personnel returning from compromised operations. But through the tent walls I could hear other voices, other survivors being brought in. Miller arrived 12 hours after me, covered in cuts and speaking in whispers. Ramirez showed up the next morning, missing his gear, and unable to stop talking about seeing himself die. Norton came in last, 36 hours after the mission started, perfectly clean, all his equipment intact, claiming he'd been at his observation post the entire time, and didn't understand why everyone had broken radio discipline. The investigators who debriefed us compared our stories like they were trying to solve a puzzle with pieces from different boxes. Our GPS trackers showed impossible data, team members in multiple locations simultaneously, paths that looped back on themselves, positions that placed us inside solid rock. The satellite footage from that night was corrupted, showing only static during the crucial hours. Shell casings recovered from the area matched our weapons, but ballistics suggested trajectories that would have required shooters to be in physically impossible positions. What haunts me most isn't the official report that classified the whole thing as a blue-on-blue incident caused by equipment failure and environmental factors. It's not even the medical discharge they gave me after I refused to bunk with other soldiers. insisting on sleeping alone with my back to a wall. What keeps me up at night is Miller's question, asked in a whisper during our last conversation before they separated us for good. How do we know which ones of us made it back? Because here's what nobody wants to acknowledge. We lost 6 men on that patrol, but 7 survivors returned to base. The investigators knew it, Crawford knew it, and we knew it. The math didn't work, but everyone was too afraid to say it out loud. They transferred us all to different units within a week, scattered us across different bases, different countries even. I never saw any of them again, and maybe that's for the best. Sometimes I catch myself in the mirror and wonder if I'm the one who didn't belong, if somewhere out there the real me is still running through that jungle. The Army gave me an honorable discharge and a monthly check to never talk about Piedra Negra, but silence doesn't stop the dreams where I'm shooting at myself in the dark. Captain Mercer just made Major, and 2 more soldiers are in the hospital because of him. My old squad mate called yesterday with the news, and I punched a hole through my apartment wall before I even realized what I was doing. 6 years have passed since Fort Irwin, since Jimmy Vasquez died in that desert, and that psychopath is still out there running training ops like nothing ever happened. I've kept my mouth shut for too long, signed their papers, took their threats seriously when they said my career would be over if I didn't play ball. But hearing about those kids in the hospital brought everything flooding back, and somebody needs to know what really went down that night in the Mojave, before more soldiers end up dead. August 2017 was hotter than Satan's armpit at Fort Irwin, with temperatures hitting 115 during the day and barely dropping below 90 at night. Our unit was there for a month of desert warfare training, mostly navigation drills and patrol exercises that should have been routine for a group of infantry guys who'd already deployed twice. Jimmy Vasquez was 22, this wisecracking kid from El Paso, who somehow managed to keep morale up even when we were all slowly losing our minds from exhaustion and dehydration. He'd enlisted right after his high school graduation in 2013, same year as me, and we'd been tight ever since we ended up in the same platoon at Fort Stewart. Kid had this thing where he'd carry twice the water he needed in his ruck, not because he was worried about himself, but because he knew somebody would run out and he wanted to be ready to help. That particular Monday started wrong from the jump when Mercer showed up to morning formation wearing his full combat gear in that heat, expecting us to be impressed or intimidated or some combination of both. He had this way of standing with his chest pushed out and his jaw clenched, like he was posing for a recruiting poster, except his eyes were always moving, always calculating who he could push and how far. First Sergeant Blackwood stood behind him looking uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, and I remember thinking something was up because Blackwood was old school, the kind of NCO who'd been in since Desert Storm, and usually didn't let officers pull stupid stunts without at least trying to talk them down. But Mercer had everyone walking on eggshells after what happened to Staff Sergeant Novak the week before, when he'd questioned why we were doing land nav at noon instead of starting before dawn like the training schedule originally said, and suddenly found himself transferred to some supply unit in Kentucky within 72 hours. Mercer announced we'd be doing a 20-kilometer movement to our night navigation point, full combat load, no resupply until we reached the objective. The weather report had heat warnings all week, saying to avoid strenuous outdoor activity between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m., but there was Mercer at 11:30 in the morning, telling us to gear up while the sun turned the sand into a frying pan. Jimmy raised his hand during the briefing, asked if we could at least take extra water since we'd be moving through the hottest part of the day, and Mercer's face went from its normal shade of sunburned pink to this deep purple color. He walked right up to Jimmy, close enough that their noses almost touched, and said real quiet but loud enough for everyone to hear that maybe Vasquez needed to spend some time thinking about whether he had what it took to be a warrior or if he should transfer to the Air Force where they had air conditioning. After the briefing, Mercer pulled Jimmy aside and told him since he was so concerned about water, he could carry the squad's radio too, an extra 25 pounds of equipment in that heat. I watched Jimmy's face when he got that news, saw him bite down on his bottom lip the way he did when he was trying not to say something that would get him in deeper trouble. Specialist Carson tried to volunteer to take the radio instead. Said he was the RTO anyway, so it made sense. But Mercer shut him down with a look that could have peeled paint. We all knew what was happening because we'd seen it before with other guys who'd questioned Mercer's decisions. This systematic breaking down of anyone who didn't worship the ground he walked on. Except this time, we were about to march into the desert during the worst heat of the summer with a pissed-off captain looking to prove a point. We stepped off at noon sharp, the sun directly overhead turning our helmets into little ovens that cooked our brains while we walked. Within the first hour, 3 guys had already fallen back to the rear of the formation, their faces red as tomatoes, and their uniforms soaked through with sweat that dried into white salt stains before it could even drip off. Jimmy was up front with Mercer, carrying his regular kit plus that radio, and I could see him adjusting the straps every few minutes, trying to find a position that didn't cut off circulation to his arms. The sand was so hot it melted the soles of our boots where the glue held them together, and every step felt like walking through an oven that someone had filled with quicksand. Mercer kept increasing the pace, calling out cadence like we were on some motivational run back at Garrison, instead of a death march through the Mojave, and when Private First Class Hendricks stumbled and went down to one knee, Mercer made the whole platoon do 50 push-ups right there in the sand, while screaming about how weakness was contagious. By hour 3, Jimmy had stopped talking completely, which should have been everyone's first warning sign because that kid never shut up. Always had some joke or story to keep spirits up even in the worst conditions. His face had gone from red to this weird grayish color, and he was swaying with each step like a drunk person trying to walk a straight line. I tried to catch up to him, wanted to take that radio off his back or at least give him some of my water, but Mercer kept me in my position, said any more disruptions to the formation would result in Article 15s for everyone involved. Specialist Washington whispered to me that he'd seen Jimmy dump out his last water bottle an hour ago, completely empty, and now he was just gutting it out on pure willpower and fear of what Mercer would do if he fell out of formation. The sun was starting to set when it happened, that golden hour light making everything look peaceful and beautiful, like some kind of sick joke while we were all dying inside. Jimmy took 3 more steps, then his legs just gave out like someone had cut his strings, and he went down hard, face first into the sand with all that gear on top of him. The radio made this awful crunching sound when he hit, and for a second nobody moved because Mercer had trained us so well not to break formation without permission. Then training kicked in, and me and Carson rushed to flip him over, get his helmet off, start checking his vitals while someone else called for the medic on their radio. Jimmy's eyes were rolled back in his head. His skin was dry and burning hot to the touch. No sweat at all, which meant his body had completely given up trying to cool itself down. And when I tried to find a pulse, it was going so fast, it felt like a hummingbird trapped under his skin. Mercer stood over us while we worked on Jimmy. Not helping, not calling for faster medical support, just watching with this expression on his face that I'll never forget, like he was disappointed Jimmy had proven him right about being weak. He actually said, and I quote this word for word because it's burned into my memory, that this was what happened when soldiers didn't maintain proper physical fitness standards and tried to take shortcuts. Carson looked up at him with pure hatred in his eyes and said, "Sir, Vasquez ran a perfect PFT last month, 300 score, and Mercer just shrugged and said heat casualties were usually pre-existing conditions that the Army didn't catch during recruitment." The medic was still nowhere to be seen, and when Washington tried calling again, we found out they were positioned at the finish point, 20 minutes away by vehicle on rough terrain, because Mercer hadn't wanted them slowing down the movement by being embedded with us. We tried everything we knew from our combat lifesaver training while waiting for that medic. Poured what little water we had left on Jimmy's neck and armpits, elevated his legs, fanned him with anything we could find. But his body was too far gone into heat stroke. His breathing got shallower and shallower, these tiny little gasps like a fish out of water, and then it just stopped altogether right as we heard the medical vehicle's engine in the distance. Carson started chest compressions immediately, while I gave rescue breaths, counting out loud to keep rhythm. But Jimmy's lips were already turning blue despite the heat, and his pupils were fixed and dilated when I checked them with my flashlight. The medics took over when they arrived, shot him full of drugs, and continued CPR all the way to the medical station. But we all knew he was gone, had been gone probably since before they even got there, killed by one man's ego and need to prove his authority. They pronounced Jimmy dead at the medical station 45 minutes later. Official cause listed as heat stroke, with complications from a previously undiagnosed heart condition, which was complete bullshit because Jimmy had just passed his physical 2 months before with flying colors. Within hours, Criminal Investigation Division showed up, but not to investigate Mercer, no. They came to interview us about whether Vasquez had been drinking the night before, if he'd been taking any supplements, if maybe he'd been hiding some medical issue from the command. Mercer had already gotten his story straight with the battalion commander, painted this picture of a young soldier who'd pushed himself beyond his limits despite repeated warnings to hydrate and rest, completely reversing what actually happened. When me and Carson tried to tell them about the punishment with the extra gear, about Mercer refusing to let anyone help Jimmy when he was struggling, about the medics being deliberately positioned too far away, we got pulled aside by First Sergeant Blackwood, who told us in very clear terms that our version of events didn't match the official report, and maybe we were suffering from heat exhaustion ourselves, confused about what we remembered. They shipped Jimmy's body home to El Paso in a flag-draped coffin, told his mother her son was a hero who died serving his country, never mentioned that his death was completely preventable, that he'd been targeted and punished for having the audacity to ask for extra water in 115-degree heat. Most of us from the platoon pooled money to send flowers to the funeral, but we weren't allowed to attend because we were still in training, still under Mercer's command for another 2 weeks of hell, where he made sure to remind us daily that weak soldiers got themselves killed. 3 guys went AWOL after that, just disappeared into the desert one night rather than spend another day under that monster's command, and honestly, I understood why. The rest of us kept our heads down, graduated the training, and scattered to different units as fast as we could, but not before Mercer made sure our evaluation reports mentioned we had difficulty performing under stress and questioned leadership decisions, career-killing bullets that followed most of us for years. I got out in 2022 after my second contract ended. Couldn't stomach the idea of staying in an organization that protected people like Mercer, while good kids like Jimmy got buried with lies. Carson left a year before me, works construction now in Colorado. Still has nightmares about that day according to his wife who reached out to me on Facebook last Christmas. Washington stayed in, but transferred to the National Guard. Said he couldn't do active duty anymore after what happened. We tried one more time to get someone to listen in 2019 when a senator's office was investigating training deaths. Sent them everything we had, including photos we'd taken that day showing the conditions, the timeline, even a recording Washington had made on his phone of Mercer, berating Jimmy during the march. But nothing came of it because Mercer had connections, golf buddies with stars on their shoulders, who made sure his record stayed clean. Now he's Major Mercer, probably on track to make Lieutenant Colonel within a few years, still running soldiers into the ground in Nevada, and all I can do is post this story on every military forum I can find, hoping maybe someone with more power than me will finally do something. Jimmy's mom still texts me on his birthday every year, tells me about his sisters who all graduated college now, how proud he would have been of them. And every time I have to swallow the guilt of not doing more, not pushing harder, not finding some way to get justice for her son. But maybe if enough people read this, if enough people know what really happened to Private First Class James Vasquez on August 14, 2017, maybe the next kid who questions an illegal order in dangerous conditions won't end up in a box, and maybe someday Mercer will finally face consequences for what he did, though I'm not holding my breath because the system protects its own, always has, always will. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from spending 12 hours under a Humvee in the middle of winter, and that night, I had it bad. I'm a specialist in the Army, stationed out west, and I'd been pulling double shifts at the motor pool ever since my deployment orders came through. My 26th birthday had passed 3 weeks earlier, celebrated with a gas station sandwich between vehicle inspections, and I was still grinding through the pre-deployment checklist that seemed to grow longer every day. That particular Friday in March 2023, I didn't leave post until 11:15, my hands raw from handling frozen metal all day, and my back screaming from being twisted into positions the human spine was never meant to hold. The drive home took me along Route 115, this desolate stretch of two-lane highway that cuts through about 40 miles of absolutely nothing. Most nights I'd have music going or a podcast to keep my brain engaged, but my phone had died around hour 10 of my shift, and I'd left my car charger in my other vehicle. So it was just me in the road, with maybe 3 or 4 cars passing the entire trip. The highway dips and curves through these rolling plains where you can go 10 miles without seeing a single light. And about 20 miles from post, right where the terrain drops into this wide valley, the fatigue hit me like a brick. My eyelids felt like they had weights attached, and I caught myself drifting across the center line twice in 5 minutes. When I spotted the gravel turnout ahead, just this little semicircle of packed dirt off the shoulder, I knew I needed to stop before I wrapped my car around a guardrail. I pulled in and killed the engine, letting my head fall back against the seat. The silence was immediate and total, the kind you only get in the middle of nowhere with no wind and no traffic. I set a timer on my watch for 15 minutes, figuring that would be enough to reset my brain without falling into actual sleep. My water bottle was in the back seat, still half full from that morning, and the first sip of it was warm and plastic tasting, but I didn't care. I rolled down the window a crack to let some cold air in, and that's when I realized how completely alone I was out there. No houses, no lights, nothing but darkness stretching in every direction. It should have been peaceful, but something about the emptiness made my skin prickle. I told myself it was just the fatigue making me jumpy. I'd been sitting there maybe 5 minutes, eyes closed but not quite sleeping, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. My eyes snapped open and I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see another car pulling in to do the same thing I was doing. But what I saw made my gut tighten. A dark sedan, maybe a Chevy or Ford, had parked about 30 feet behind me at an angle, nose pointed toward the highway like it was ready to leave quickly. The headlights were off, completely off. And whoever was inside wasn't getting out or doing anything, just sitting there in the darkness. I sat up straighter, suddenly very awake, and watched the mirror. The car didn't move. Nobody emerged. It just sat there, this black shape barely visible against the night sky, and every instinct I had started screaming that this wasn't right. I reached for my phone before remembering it was dead, which sent a fresh wave of anxiety through my chest. My keys were still in the ignition, and I slowly wrapped my fingers around them without making any sudden movements. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just someone else who needed a break. Or maybe they were lost and checking a map. But then why park so far back? Why keep the lights off? I kept my eyes on the mirror, barely breathing, and counted the seconds. 30 passed, then 60. The car still didn't move, and I couldn't see anyone inside because the windows were too dark. My training kicked in enough to make me assess the situation logically. One exit, blocked by the sedan. Open terrain on both sides, but my little Nissan sedan wasn't exactly built for off-roading through desert scrub. And if I started my engine now, whoever was back there would know I was spooked. Then the driver's door opened. I watched a figure step out, backlit by the dome light for just a second before it went dark again. Tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing what looked like jeans and a dark jacket, civilian clothes. The person closed the door quietly, too quietly, like they didn't want to make noise, and started walking toward my car. Not in a hurry, just this steady, purposeful walk that made my heart start hammering against my ribs. I sat perfectly still, my right hand still on my keys, my left reaching down to make sure my door was locked. It was. The figure kept coming, and as they got closer, I could make out more details in my side mirror. White guy, maybe in his 40s, with short hair and a square jaw. Something about the way he moved was too controlled, too deliberate. When he got within 10 feet of my driver's side window, he raised his hand and knocked on the glass. 3 sharp raps that made me jump despite trying to stay calm. I cracked the window maybe an inch, just enough to hear him, but not enough for him to reach through. "Can I help you?" My voice came out steadier than I felt, and I was grateful for that. The man leaned down slightly, and in the dim glow from my dashboard, I could see his face clearly now. Clean-shaven, hard eyes, the kind of expression that gave away nothing. "Military police," he said, his tone flat and official. "Need to see your identification and registration." My brain stuttered for a second. Military police, out here, in civilian clothes, in an unmarked car with the lights off? Nothing about this made sense. Real MPs drove marked vehicles, wore uniforms, or at least had visible badges, and they sure as hell didn't lurk in highway turnouts at midnight waiting for random soldiers. "Can I see your credentials?" I asked, keeping my voice level but firm. I'd been stopped by actual MPs before, and they always showed ID first. The man straightened up, and for just a moment something flickered across his face. Annoyance, maybe, or calculation. "Wait here," he said, then turned and started walking back toward his car. But he didn't walk like someone going to get identification. He walked like someone who'd just had their bluff called. My pulse was racing now, and I watched him in the mirror as he got about halfway back to the sedan. Then he stopped, pulled something from his pocket that looked like a phone, and appeared to be texting or calling someone. That's when I saw the headlights. A second vehicle, a large SUV or truck, came rolling up the highway with its high beams off, just running lights, and it slowed down as it approached the turnout. My entire body went cold. This wasn't random. This was coordinated. The SUV pulled in behind the sedan, completely blocking the only exit back onto the highway, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was in serious danger. I didn't wait to see who got out of the second vehicle. My hand twisted the key and the engine roared to life, way too loud in the silent night. The man who'd knocked on my window spun around and started running back toward me, yelling something I couldn't hear over the blood pounding in my ears. I yanked the wheel hard to the right toward the open desert and stomped on the gas. My car lurched forward, tires spinning in the gravel before catching, and I went straight off the edge of the turnout into the scrub brush. The suspension screamed as I hit the uneven ground, sagebrush scraping the undercarriage with sounds like nails on metal. My headlights bounced wildly, illuminating nothing but dirt and rocks and scattered vegetation. Behind me, I could see lights now. Both vehicles had their high beams on, and at least one of them was trying to follow me into the brush. But my car was smaller, lighter, and I was running on pure adrenaline and terror. I kept the gas pedal floored, steering around the bigger rocks and praying I didn't hit a drainage ditch or blow a tire. The terrain sloped upwards slightly, and my little sedan struggled, engine whining, but I kept pushing it. After what felt like forever but was probably only 30 seconds, I saw the highway again, the northbound lane about 50 yards ahead. I aimed for it, crashed through a final stretch of low brush, and my tires hit pavement with a screech that probably took years off the rubber. I didn't slow down. I merged onto the highway going 60 and kept accelerating, checking my rear view obsessively. The lights behind me had stopped at the edge of the brush. They weren't following onto the road. I drove for another 10 miles before my hands started shaking so badly I had to pull into a gas station just to breathe. The attendant inside looked at me like I'd seen a ghost, which I guess wasn't far from the truth. I borrowed his phone and called the local police, told them everything while sitting under the fluorescent lights with a bottle of water I couldn't even open because my hands wouldn't work right. The dispatcher took my information, told me a unit would meet me there, and asked if I needed medical attention. I said no, but honestly, I wasn't sure. 2 sheriff's deputies showed up 20 minutes later, and I walked them through the whole thing again. They took notes, asked good questions, seemed to take it seriously. One of them mentioned they'd had reports of suspicious activity along that stretch of highway, people getting followed or hassled, but nothing quite like what I described. They offered to escort me home, which I accepted without hesitation. I filed a formal report the next morning at the station, gave them every detail I could remember about the sedan and the SUV, though I hadn't caught any plate numbers in the chaos. What happened next is the part that still keeps me up sometimes. 2 days later, a detective called me. They'd found a burned-out vehicle at that exact turnout, completely torched, nothing left but a blackened frame and melted metal. The fire department had responded to it Sunday morning after a trucker reported smoke. When investigators sifted through the wreckage, they found military gear in the trunk, stuff that had survived the fire enough to be identifiable. Tactical vests, what looked like parts of uniforms, equipment that absolutely should not have been in some random civilian's car. The detective said they were treating it as connected to my incident, possibly part of a theft ring targeting military personnel or installations. He told me I'd made the right call running, that these people were clearly professionals who knew what they were doing. They never caught whoever was driving those vehicles, and I never found out if that gear was stolen from Post or from someone like me. The case went cold after a few months. I take a different route home now, even though it adds 15 minutes to the drive. I never stop on highways anymore, no matter how tired I get, and I keep my phone charged religiously. Sometimes I think about how close I came to rolling down that window further, or waiting longer before running, or any number of small decisions that could have changed everything. The detective told me that whoever they were, they'd clearly done this before, that the coordinated approach and the fake MP angle suggested experience. What bothers me most isn't even the danger I was in, though that's bad enough. It's knowing they're still out there somewhere, maybe still working that same stretch of road, maybe targeting other soldiers who are too tired or trusting to question things. I reported every detail I could remember to both the local police and my chain of command, even sat down with CID investigators who wanted to know if I'd noticed anything suspicious on Post in the weeks before. They seemed to think these people had inside knowledge, knew schedules or patterns. I deployed 4 months after all this happened, and honestly, being overseas felt safer than driving that highway. When I got back stateside last year, the first thing I did was check if there'd been any updates on the case. There hadn't been. No arrests, no new leads, just my statement and that burned car sitting in an evidence lot somewhere. I still wonder sometimes what would have happened if I'd been too exhausted to question that fake badge, or if my car hadn't made it through that terrain. Some nights I wake up hearing those 3 sharp knocks on glass, and I have to remind myself I made it out. Not everyone might have been that lucky. Someone asked me to share what happened during my time at Fort Hood, and honestly, I still get this weird feeling in my chest when I think about it. I'd been working as a logistics coordinator for about 18 months when this all went down. One of those jobs where you're basically shuffling supplies and paperwork while pretending the coffee hasn't gone cold for the 3rd time that shift. The apartment complex where I lived sat about 2 miles from the main gate, one of those places that catered specifically to enlisted folks who wanted to get away from the barracks but couldn't afford anything fancy. My unit was on the 2nd floor, number 214, facing the parking lot where I could see my beat-up Mazda from the kitchen window. The place had that generic rental smell, like industrial carpet cleaner mixed with whoever lived there before, but it was mine, and I'd made it comfortable with some plants and posters that made the beige walls less depressing. The first time I noticed something wrong was on a Wednesday in late January. I just finished a graveyard shift that had me processing inventory reports until my eyes felt like sandpaper, and when I trudged up the stairs to my apartment around 7 in the morning, I could have sworn the door wasn't quite flush with the frame. Not wide open or anything obvious, just that tiny gap where you could see a sliver of darkness inside instead of the door sitting properly in its frame. I stood there for a solid 30 seconds, my work bag hanging off one shoulder, trying to remember if I'd been in such a rush the night before that I hadn't pulled it shut completely. The lock had clicked when I left. I was pretty sure of that, but exhaustion has a way of making you doubt your own memory. I pushed it open slowly, half expecting to find my stuff ransacked or my cat freaking out, but everything looked exactly how I'd left it. The dishes were still in the sink, my boots by the door, the throw blanket on the couch in the same wrinkled heap. I checked every room, every closet, even looked under the bed like some paranoid kid. But there was nothing. No broken windows, no missing valuables, nothing that would explain why my door hadn't been properly closed. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was just tired and seeing problems where there weren't any. But then it happened again the following week. Same scenario. Night shift. Came home to find that same tiny gap between the door and frame, like someone had pulled it almost closed but not quite hard enough for the latch to catch. This time I was sure I'd locked it properly because I specifically remembered jiggling the handle twice before heading to my car, something I'd started doing after the first incident. My neighbor across the hall, this guy named Kevin who worked in transportation, was getting his newspaper when I came up the stairs. He gave me this casual wave and I almost asked him if he'd seen anyone near my door, but the words felt stupid in my mouth. What was I going to say, that my door wasn't closing right? That I thought someone might be coming into my apartment but leaving everything exactly as it was? It sounded ridiculous even in my own head, like the plot of some bad thriller where the woman is just being hysterical. But here's the thing that really got under my skin. I started noticing these tiny differences that I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. My bathroom towel would be hanging slightly crooked when I was obsessive about keeping it straight. The chair at my kitchen table would be pulled out a few inches when I always pushed it in. One morning I found my bedroom closet door open maybe 6 inches, and I never left it open because the squeaky hinge annoyed me. These weren't big disruptions, nothing you could point to and say definitively that someone had been there, but they were enough to make me feel like my space was being violated in some subtle, creeping way. I started taking pictures of my apartment before I left for work, stupid little snapshots of how I arranged things, just so I could compare when I got back. My coworker Dana thought I was losing it when I mentioned feeling weird about my place, said maybe the cleaning staff had a key and was coming in without telling me. Except we didn't have cleaning staff at that complex, and I sure as hell wasn't paying for any service like that. The third week of February, I decided to do something about it instead of just sitting there feeling creeped out. I went down to the apartment office and talked to the property manager, this older woman named Diane, who had that permanent look of someone dealing with complaints all day. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, tried not to sound like I was accusing anyone of anything, just said I was concerned about my lock maybe being faulty. She pulled up my file on her computer, tapping her nails on the desk while she scrolled, and told me that my unit had been keyed with a digital access system that was supposedly more secure than traditional locks. Each resident got a key card that was programmed specifically for their unit, and the system kept a log of every entry. She said if I was really worried, she could request the access logs from the past month, but it would take a few days to pull together. I told her yes, absolutely. I wanted to see those logs. Something in my voice must have convinced her I wasn't just being paranoid, because she made a note in her computer and said she'd have them by the end of the week. Those next few days were torture. I couldn't focus at work, kept checking my phone every 10 minutes like the logs were going to magically appear in my email. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked from the inside, even though that felt insane, because who locks their bedroom door in their own apartment? But I couldn't shake this feeling that someone had been in my space, touching my things, standing in my kitchen while I was gone. I even bought one of those cheap doorstop alarms from the store on base, the kind that screams if someone tries to open the door while you're inside. My cat absolutely hated the thing, nearly gave herself a heart attack the first time she brushed against it, and set it off. When Friday finally rolled around, I practically ran to the office during my lunch break. Diane had the printout waiting for me in a manila folder, and the look on her face told me she'd already read through it. She slid it across the desk and said there were some entries that didn't match up with when I said I was home, and that she'd already contacted the main office about it. I opened that folder right there at her desk, and my hands were shaking so bad the pages rattled. The log showed my keycard entries, all the times I'd come and gone, which matched up with my memory perfectly. But there were other entries too, marked with a different card number, happening in the early morning hours when I was at work. Someone had accessed my apartment 7 times over the past month. 7 times. Always between 3 and 5 in the morning, always when they somehow knew I wouldn't be there. The entries were time-stamped down to the minute. February 2nd at 4:18 in the morning, stayed for 42 minutes. February 9th at 3:30, stayed for an hour and 12 minutes. The most recent one was just 3 days ago. I felt this wave of nausea hit me so hard I thought I might throw up right there on Diane's desk. Someone had been in my home, in my bedroom, going through my things while I was working night shift. The violation of it made my skin feel wrong, like I needed to peel it off and start over. Diane called the police right then, didn't even ask if I wanted to file a report, just picked up her phone and dialed. 2 officers showed up within 20 minutes, a younger guy and an older woman who had this no-nonsense attitude that actually made me feel a little better. They took my statement, photographed the access logs, and explained that they'd need to pull security footage from the complex's cameras. The property had cameras in the parking lot and near the main entrance, supposedly for resident safety, though I'd never paid much attention to them before. The female officer, her name tag said Phillips, told me they'd also need to figure out whose keycard was being used to access my unit. Each card had a unique identifier in the system, so it wasn't anonymous. Someone specific had that card, and the system would tell them exactly who it had been issued to. She asked me if I had any ex-boyfriends or anyone who might have a reason to want access to my place, and I told her no, nobody like that. I'd been single for over a year and kept mostly to myself outside of work. It took them 3 days to trace the keycard, and those were the longest 3 days of my life. I stayed with Dana during that time, sleeping on her couch because there was no way in hell I was going back to my apartment alone. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. The police had advised me not to change my routine too drastically because they wanted to see if the person would try to access the unit again, maybe catch him on camera or even in the act, but I couldn't stomach the idea of being bait. When Officer Phillips finally called me, her voice had this edge to it that made my chest tighten before she even said anything. The key card belonged to a guy named Adrian Sutton, former Army specialist who'd been discharged 2 years prior. He'd lived in my exact apartment, Unit 214, from 2013 to 2015 before moving off to some other assignment. When he'd left, he was supposed to turn in his key card to the office, standard procedure, but apparently he'd reported it lost, and they'd just deactivated it in the system and issued him a replacement for the checkout process. Except the deactivation never actually went through. Some kind of clerical error, a box that didn't get checked in the computer, and his old card stayed active in the system all this time. The security footage was worse than I could have imagined. The officers showed me clips on a laptop at the station, and I had to watch this man, this complete stranger, walking up to my building in regular jeans and a jacket like he belonged there. He knew exactly where the cameras were positioned because he'd lived there, so he kept his head down, ball cap pulled low, but they got enough of his face to confirm it was Sutton. The footage showed him swiping the card at my door, glancing around once to make sure no one was in the hallway, then slipping inside. He stayed in there for over an hour on the clip they showed me. When he came out, he was carrying nothing, hands in his pockets, casual as anything. Officer Phillips explained that they'd already been to his current address, a rental house about 15 miles away, and when they searched the place, they found items belonging to 3 other women: jewelry, clothing, photographs, even a journal that wasn't his. Turns out I wasn't his only victim. He'd been doing this to multiple women in different apartment complexes around the base, all places where he'd previously lived or had some connection to. He had a whole system, kept spreadsheets on his computer tracking which units he could access, and when the residents worked night shifts, they arrested him that same day, charged him with multiple counts of burglary, stalking, and trespassing. The detective assigned to the case told me that Sutton had been exploiting security gaps in the housing system for at least 18 months, maybe longer. He'd figured out that when people moved out of base housing, the deactivation process wasn't always followed through properly, especially in older apartment complexes with outdated management software. He'd test old key cards periodically to see which ones still worked. Then he'd research who lived in those units now, figure out their schedules through social media or just by watching the parking lot. The whole thing was so calculated and predatory that it made me feel sick. What really got me was that he'd taken almost nothing from my apartment. A few photos from my phone that I'd printed out and kept on my fridge, one of my old PT shirts that I thought I'd just misplaced. He wasn't robbing people in the traditional sense. He was collecting pieces of their lives, souvenirs, like we were trophies or something. Officer Phillips said he'd probably been building up to something worse, that stalkers like him usually escalate over time. The apartment complex terminated my lease without penalty and helped me move to a different unit in another building, one with a completely new key card system and updated locks. They also had to notify every single resident about the security breach and reissue all the key cards in the entire complex, which caused this massive headache for everyone, but was absolutely necessary. Sutton ended up pleading guilty to avoid trial, got sentenced to 6 years in prison plus probation, and a restraining order against all his victims. I had to go to court twice, once for the preliminary hearing and once for sentencing, and seeing him sitting there in an orange jumpsuit with this blank expression on his face made me realize he didn't even see us as real people. We were just accessible, just targets. I still live near Fort Hood, different complex now, but I check my door 3 times before I leave, and I have a security camera inside my apartment that sends alerts to my phone. Some people think I'm paranoid, but they weren't the ones who had a stranger spending hours in their bedroom going through their things. Dana tells me I should move somewhere completely different, start fresh, but honestly, I refuse to let that creep run me out of my life. I earned my place here and he's the one locked up, not me. When I started volunteering for the Veterans Oral History Project, I thought it would be mostly paperwork and camera setups. I wasn't a historian, just a part-time technician helping record interviews for the archive. The goal was simple: capture the stories of service members before time, and silence swallowed them. Most sessions went the same way: polite introductions, some nervous laughter, and long pauses between memories. Then one afternoon, they sent me the file of a man named Elliot Marsh. His record showed a clean discharge and a few commendations. Nothing unusual. He arrived exactly on time, dressed neatly, his posture too rigid for someone who'd been out of uniform for years. He spoke softly but carried that kind of discipline you don't unlearn. At first, it was standard stuff: base life, desert heat, patrols that blurred together. His words came steady, measured, the kind of rhythm you get when you've told the same stories to family gatherings. But about 20 minutes in, something in his voice changed, a hesitation that didn't match the rest. He glanced toward the camera light, then at me, and asked if the recording was secure. I told him yes, standard digital capture, local backup, nothing special. He nodded but didn't seem convinced. Then, out of nowhere, he said there was one mission that never made it into any report. His expression tightened, and he pressed his palms flat on the table as if steadying himself. "They told us it was a rescue," he said, "but that's not what it turned into." The air in the room shifted after that. He described a night operation deep in an unnamed valley. No coordinates, no date. His unit was ordered to secure a group of civilians supposedly linked to insurgents. But when they arrived, there were no weapons, no defenses, just a cluster of families huddled near burned-out vehicles. He said they were told to wait for extraction, but no one came. Hours passed, and the radio stayed silent. Then, without command, half his squad vanished into the dark. Elliot's eyes drifted toward the corner of the room as he talked, like he was tracking something only he could see. His breathing got uneven, and his tone lowered almost to a whisper. He said the people they were guarding didn't speak, didn't move much, and didn't seem afraid. One of the civilians, a woman in a torn blue scarf, kept looking past them, over their shoulders, as if waiting for someone else to arrive. He said when dawn came, the sun hit the valley wrong. The ground looked black like wet glass, and none of the missing soldiers were ever found. I remember trying to ask clarifying questions, to keep the session professional, but the words stuck. The atmosphere in the room felt heavy, charged. He rubbed his temples and said that later, during roll call, they'd still heard voices answering back, names belonging to those who'd disappeared. He laughed nervously and said he still hears them sometimes, late at night when he can't sleep. Then he went silent, staring down at his hands. They were trembling slightly, and his nails dug into his palms until I thought he might break the skin. I stopped the camera for a minute and asked if he wanted to take a break. He didn't respond, just sat there, breathing slow, eyes darting from the window to the wall behind me. After a while, he said something I couldn't make sense of, that the faces he saw back then still reported in, like they were waiting for orders. I turned the camera back on, but he seemed distant now, detached from the present. His words came fragmented, disjointed, half sentences swallowed by long pauses. Then, all at once, he leaned forward and whispered, "They still think it's nighttime." His voice cracked when he said it. I tried to ask what he meant, but before I could finish, he stood up and walked out of frame. The door didn't close. It just creaked slowly until the room was empty on screen. I thought maybe he needed air, so I gave him a minute. When I finally stepped into the hall, there was no sign of him. His jacket still hung on the chair, his folder on the table, but the corridor outside was completely empty. Security searched the building, every office and stairwell, but no one saw him leave. The entrance camera never picked him up either. It was as if he'd vanished between frames. I filed a report, filled out every box I could, and left a note on the archive log explaining that the interview had ended abruptly. The rest of that evening is a blur. I remember locking the storage room myself, sealing the tape, and trying to convince myself that he'd just walked out quietly and slipped past the cameras somehow. A few days later, I came back to process the footage. The file was still labeled Marsh Elliott, Interview A. It played normally at first, and the introductions, the small talk, everything exactly as I remembered. Then right where he leaned forward and whispered that last sentence, the image warped. His face blurred, and the sound distorted into static. The recording cut off mid-word. After that, there was a few seconds of darkness, and then a slow, rhythmic breathing close to the mic. Not his voice, not mine. I checked the system logs thinking maybe someone tampered with the file, but there was no sign of access. The room had been locked since that day. The tape was supposed to be stored offline, but somehow it showed a new timestamp. The night before I reviewed it. I didn't tell anyone. I just made a copy of the footage and kept it hidden at home, unsure if I'd ever be able to explain it. Every few months, the archive asks if I want to resume interviews, and I always find a reason to decline. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I play that last section with the volume all the way up. You can hear faint voices under the breathing, quiet, clipped, like names being called one after another. I've compared them to his transcript. They match the names of the soldiers he said were gone. The original file is still stored in the project's cold archive, labeled as incomplete, but I've stopped checking it. Some stories, I think, aren't meant to be preserved. I'd been driving cross-country for work that summer, doing maintenance checks on comms equipment for different army bases. Most nights I slept in the truck, but that day had been long and brutally hot, so when I saw a flickering vacancy sign near the edge of a small base town, I decided to stop. The place was called the Pines Motel, though there weren't any pine trees anywhere nearby, just scrub grass and a cracked parking lot. The guy at the counter looked like he'd been carved out of old leather, buzz cut and sunburned cheeks, the kind of posture that doesn't go away even after you hang up the uniform. He introduced himself as Rick, Said he used to be military police back in his day. "I give discounts to anyone who's ever worn a patch," he joked, tapping the counter with a grin. His stories came quick, about patrols overseas, long deployments, and kids these days who didn't know what discipline was. He seemed harmless enough, maybe a little too eager to talk, but I'd met plenty of retired guys like him. I signed the logbook, got my key, and headed to room 4, the one closest to the end of the row. The room smelled faintly of bleach and air freshener, but it was clean. Old floral curtains, buzzing neon leaking through the window, a TV bolted to the dresser with a cracked remote. I showered, grabbed a soda from the vending machine outside, and sat out front on one of the plastic chairs while the sun went down. Rick came by again, carrying a clipboard, and started chatting about how he liked to keep an eye on things, since the base traffic kept the area busy. He asked what kind of work I did, where I was headed, and whether I'd been stationed nearby before. His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered on my truck longer than seemed normal. Later that night, around 11, I noticed something strange. From the bed, I could see a faint red light blinking near the vent above the door. At first, I figured it was a smoke detector, but when I stood on the chair to check, it looked more like a small lens embedded into the plastic grill. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe an old security sensor. But the idea stuck in my head, heavy and uneasy. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, Rick was already outside sweeping the walkway when I stepped out. He greeted me like we were old friends, offered coffee from a thermos, and asked if I'd slept all right. I lied and said I had. He mentioned he was running the place mostly for the boys passing through, meaning soldiers from the nearby base who needed a cheap night between transfers. He even bragged about keeping the rates lower than the chains in town, because they deserve a break. It all sounded generous on the surface, but something about how rehearsed it felt made me uneasy. While packing my gear, I noticed faint scratches around the base of the mirror near the bathroom door, like someone had tried to pry it off with a screwdriver. Behind it, there was a subtle hum, mechanical, low, almost like wiring behind the wall. I leaned closer but stopped when the front door creaked open. Rick stood there holding a towel, smiling. Said he was just checking if I needed extras for the road. I thanked him and locked the door as soon as he left. The hum behind the mirror seemed louder after that. I checked out around 10, drove to a diner near the highway, and couldn't shake the feeling that I'd dodged something. When the waitress asked where I'd stayed, I mentioned the Pines. Her face went still. She said she thought that place had shut down months ago. Claimed the property had been condemned for code violations. No running water, electrical hazards, the works. But I'd just been there less than an hour earlier. When I insisted it was open, she just stared at me and said, "Honey, nobody's supposed to be living out there." I called the local sheriff's office that afternoon to ask about it, figuring maybe Rick was running it off the books. The deputy on the line asked for my name and told me to stay where I was. Within 30 minutes, 2 officers showed up at the diner, took my statement, and asked me to describe the man. When I said his name was Rick, one of them exchanged a look with the other. They didn't tell me much, just that they'd been looking for him for a while. They asked if I still had my room key. I did, and they took it as evidence. 2 days later, an investigator called to follow up. He said they'd gone to the property early that morning and found the entire motel empty. Doors unlocked, office ransacked, lights still on. The basement door had been forced open, and inside were signs of something worse. There were faint blood traces along the drain and wiring that ran from the ceiling, down through a mess of disconnected monitors. Every guest room had hidden cameras disguised as vents, mirrors, even wall hooks. Most of them were wired to a central system in the basement. The man I'd met, Rick, was gone. The investigator explained that several missing soldiers had last been traced to the same stretch of road over the past year. Most were young, just traveling through between assignments. Their names showed up in the motel's handwritten logbook, the same one I'd signed. When authorities compared it with records from nearby bases, none of those men had ever checked in at their next destinations. Rick's real name wasn't Rick at all. It belonged to a retired military police officer who'd left service under investigation for misconduct years earlier. They suspected he'd been luring young servicemen by offering discounts, then drugging them. What happened after, nobody could say for sure. The blood evidence was partial, not enough for confirmation, and there were no bodies, only fragments of uniforms, scraps of tape, and boot soles buried behind the property. The agent told me they believed he'd fled the state within hours of me leaving that morning. My report was the last confirmed encounter anyone had with him. It's been years since then, and I still think about that night every time I pass a small roadside motel. I keep wondering how many people smiled back at that same man, handed him cash, and went to sleep under those same vents. Sometimes I wake up on the road and glance around, half expecting to see that faint red light blinking somewhere in the dark. I never stayed at another mom-and-pop place again, not after the Pines. Some things you can't unsee, even if you only saw them once. My mom had barely pulled out of the driveway when I started thinking about that frozen lasagna in the freezer. It was a Saturday afternoon in early March, the kind of gray day where the clouds hang so low you feel like you could reach up and touch them. She left me alone for the first time in months, trusting me to handle a few hours by myself while she drove to pick up my grandmother from the airport 2 hours away. At 13, having graduated middle school the previous spring, and now navigating my first year of high school, I felt ready to prove I could be responsible. Our house sat at the end of Birchwood Lane in a quiet suburb outside of Detroit, a 2-story colonial with peeling blue paint and a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 80s. My dad had moved out the year before and money was tight, which explained why half our appliances were held together with duct tape and prayers. The microwave was one of them. I knew that microwave had problems. We all did. It had started sparking about 6 weeks earlier, little flashes of blue light that crackled behind the glass door whenever you heated something for more than 2 minutes. My mom kept saying she would replace it, kept promising that next paycheck would be the one, but something always came up. The car needed new brakes. The furnace filter had to be changed. Life kept demanding its pound of flesh, and the microwave stayed on that cracked laminate counter, humming and sparking like a ticking time bomb none of us wanted to acknowledge. She had told me 100 times to use the oven instead, to be patient and wait the extra 20 minutes for things to heat up properly. But that afternoon, standing in the kitchen with my stomach growling and 6 hours of video games calling my name, patience felt like a foreign concept. The oven seemed so slow, so unnecessary, when the microwave was right there, ready to give me hot food in 5 minutes flat. I pulled the lasagna from the freezer, a family-sized tray wrapped in plastic with instructions printed in tiny blue letters on the cardboard sleeve. The oven directions said to preheat to 375 degrees, remove the plastic film, and bake for 45 minutes. 45 minutes. That was almost an hour of my life wasted waiting for food when I could be upstairs in my room, controller in hand, grinding through the new campaign my friend Brett had been raving about all week. The microwave instructions were simpler, more appealing. Puncture the film, heat on high for 8 minutes, let stand for 2. I stood there in the kitchen, holding that frozen tray, having a silent argument with myself that lasted maybe 30 seconds. I thought about the sparks, about my mom's voice telling me to be careful, about all the reasons this was a bad idea. Then I thought about how hungry I was, how the sparks never actually did anything, how I'd used the microwave dozens of times since it started acting up, and nothing bad had ever happened. The plastic film made a satisfying pop when I punctured it with a fork. I slid the tray onto the microwave's glass turntable and punched in 8 minutes, watching the green numbers glow against the beige plastic casing. For the first minute or so, everything seemed normal. The turntable rotated slowly, the fan hummed, and I could see the frost on the lasagna starting to melt into little puddles on the surface. I leaned against the counter and pulled out my phone, scrolling through messages from Brett about strategy tips for the game. I was reading something about a secret weapon location when I heard the first crackle. It was louder than usual, a sharp snap that made me look up from my screen. Through the microwave door, I saw a flash of blue light near the back corner, right where the magnetron sat behind the inner wall. I should have stopped it right then. I should have hit cancel and accepted that the universe was telling me something. Instead, I just watched, telling myself it would be fine. It was always fine. The second crackle came with a sound I had never heard before. A wet, sizzling pop like bacon hitting a hot pan. A ribbon of orange flame curled up from somewhere behind the turntable, licking at the plastic film covering my lasagna. For a moment I just stared at it, my brain refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. Fire. There was actual fire inside the microwave. The flame grew brighter, feeding on the melting plastic, and suddenly thick black smoke began pouring out from the gaps around the door. The smell hit me next, acrid and chemical, burning the inside of my nose and making my eyes water instantly. I lunged forward and jabbed the cancel button, but the damage was already done. When I yanked open the door, a wave of heat slammed into my face and I stumbled backward as flames jumped from the ruined lasagna tray onto the paper towel roll my mom kept next to the microwave. Within seconds, that entire roll was a torch, flames racing up toward the wooden cabinets above the counter. Panic is a strange thing. It shuts down the logical part of your brain and leaves you operating on pure instinct, which sounds useful until you realize your instincts are terrible. My first thought was not to call 911. My first thought was not to run outside and get help from the neighbors. My first thought, the one that consumed every fiber of my being in that moment, was that my mom was going to kill me. She trusted me. She left me alone for the first time in forever, and within an hour I had set the kitchen on fire using the one appliance she specifically told me not to use. I could not let her find out. I could not let anyone find out. So instead of doing any of the smart things, the things they taught us in school during Fire Safety Week, I grabbed a dish towel from the drawer and started swatting at the flames like I was trying to kill a wasp. The towel caught fire almost immediately, and I dropped it with a yelp, watching it land on the linoleum floor where it began to scorch a black mark into the faded yellow surface. Water. I needed water. I spun around and grabbed the biggest pot I could find from the cabinet next to the stove, a heavy stainless steel thing my mom used for making spaghetti. I shoved it under the faucet and cranked the handle all the way, watching the water fill the pot with agonizing slowness, while behind me the fire crackled and grew. The cabinets were fully engulfed now, old dry wood that had been soaking up cooking grease for decades, and the flames were spreading across the ceiling in a rolling wave of orange and black. The smoke detector finally woke up, screaming its high-pitched alarm that drilled into my skull like a dentist's tool. I hauled the pot out of the sink, water sloshing over the sides and soaking my socks, and I threw it at the base of the flames with all the strength I had. The water hit the fire with a hiss and a cloud of steam, but it barely made a dent. The flames just flickered for a second, and then roared back to life, angrier than before, as if I had insulted them by trying something so pathetic. I filled the pot again, and again and again. Each time I threw water at the fire, and each time it seemed to do absolutely nothing. The kitchen was filling with smoke now, thick gray clouds that hung at eye level and made it impossible to breathe without coughing. My lungs burned, my eyes streamed with tears. I could barely see the sink anymore, just fumbled for the faucet by memory while the world around me dissolved into chaos. The heat was incredible, pressing against my skin like I was standing too close to a bonfire, and I could feel the hair on my arms starting to singe. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice was screaming at me to get out, to run, to save myself, but I kept fighting. I kept thinking that if I could just put out the fire, everything would be okay. I could clean up the mess, open the windows, and my mom would never have to know. That delusion kept me rooted in place while the fire consumed my kitchen inch by inch. The window above the sink shattered from the heat, and that was the moment everything changed. Cold March air rushed in, and instead of helping, it fed the flames like oxygen to a dying ember. The fire exploded outward, climbing the walls with renewed fury, and I finally understood that I was going to die in this kitchen if I did not move right now. I dropped the pot and ran for the back door, slamming my hip against the kitchen table hard enough to leave a bruise that would last for weeks. My fingers fumbled with the deadbolt, slick with sweat and shaking so badly I could barely grip the metal. Behind me, I heard something crash. The cabinets collapsing maybe, or the ceiling starting to give way. I did not look back. I just wrenched open the door and threw myself into the backyard, stumbling down the wooden steps and collapsing onto the frozen grass. The cold hit me like a slap, shocking after the inferno I had just escaped, and I lay there gasping and coughing up black mucus while smoke poured out of my house in thick dark columns that rose toward the gray sky. I do not know how long I lay there before I heard the screaming. It might have been seconds, might have been a minute, but suddenly there was a voice cutting through the roar of the fire and the ringing in my ears. It was Mr. Callahan from next door, a retired firefighter who spent most of his days tending to his vegetable garden and yelling at kids who cut across his lawn. He came running around the side of the house, his face pale and his eyes wide, wearing a flannel bathrobe and slippers like he had just been watching television when the world caught fire. He grabbed me by the shoulders and hauled me to my feet, shouting questions I could barely process. Was anyone else inside? Was I hurt? What happened? I tried to answer, tried to form words, but all that came out was a rasping cough and a sob that tore itself from somewhere deep in my chest. He half carried me across the yard, away from the house, and deposited me on the sidewalk before sprinting back toward his own home, shouting something about calling 911 and checking on the Delgados on the other side. The fire trucks arrived 7 minutes later, though it felt like hours. By then, the entire first floor of our house was engulfed, flames shooting out of the kitchen windows and licking up toward the second story where my bedroom was. I sat on the curb wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket that someone had draped over my shoulders, watching firefighters in heavy gear drag hoses across our front lawn and spray thousands of gallons of water at a house that used to be my home. The Delgados stood in their driveway, a young couple with a baby who had moved in just 6 months earlier, watching with horror as embers drifted toward their roof and firefighters scrambled to wet down their siding to keep the fire from spreading. I saw the wife clutching their infant daughter against her chest, tears streaming down her face, and something inside me cracked wide open. That baby could have died. Those people could have lost everything. Because I wanted to save 40 minutes on a frozen lasagna. Because I was too impatient, too stupid, too desperate to hide my mistake to do the right thing and call for help when I still had the chance. My mom arrived just as the firefighters were declaring the blaze under control. She came tearing down Birchwood Lane in her old Subaru, my grandmother in the passenger seat looking terrified, and before the car had even fully stopped, she was out of the driver's seat and running toward me. I expected anger. I expected screaming. I expected her to demand to know what I had done, to shake me and ask me how I could be so stupid. Instead, she just dropped to her knees on the wet pavement and pulled me into her arms so tight I could barely breathe, sobbing into my smoke-stained hair while she repeated over and over that I was okay, that I was alive, that nothing else mattered. I broke down completely then, confessing everything between gasping sobs. The microwave, the sparks, the lasagna, my pathetic attempts to put out the fire instead of calling for help. She just held me tighter and told me we would figure it out, that we would get through this together, that houses could be rebuilt but I could not be replaced. That made me cry even harder, because I knew I did not deserve that kind of grace. We lost almost everything that day. The fire gutted the entire first floor and caused so much smoke and water damage to the second floor that most of our belongings were unsalvageable. My mom's wedding photos, gone. My grandmother's quilt that had been in the family for 4 generations, gone. All my video games, my clothes, my books, every physical reminder of my childhood, gone. Insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough, and we spent the next 8 months living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment while the house was rebuilt. My dad, who had barely spoken to us since the divorce, actually showed up to help. He took time off work to sort through the wreckage with my mom, salvaging what little could be saved, and for a while it almost felt like we were a family again. The Delgados forgave me eventually. Their house survived with only minor damage to the siding, and the wife, her name was Rosa, I learned later, brought us casseroles every week while we were in that apartment. I could barely look her in the eye for months, but she never once made me feel like the monster I knew I was. That was 11 years ago. I am 24 now, working as an electrician of all things, and I think about that day more often than I would like to admit. I still cannot use a microwave without checking it obsessively, without standing right there watching through the glass door for any sign of trouble. The smell of burning plastic makes me nauseous. Smoke alarms send me into a spiral of anxiety that takes hours to shake. But here's the thing I learned from that day, the lesson that burned itself into my brain, along with all those other scars. Asking for help is not weakness. Admitting you made a mistake is not failure. The real failure is letting pride and fear turn a small problem into a catastrophe. If I had just called 911 when the fire started, when it was still contained to the microwave, they could have been there in minutes. The damage would have been minimal. Nobody would have been in danger. Instead, I let my terror of getting in trouble almost kill me and the family next door. I share this story now because I want other kids, other peoples to understand that no mistake is worth dying over. No punishment is worse than what could happen if you try to hide a fire. When things go wrong, swallow your pride and ask for help. It might just save your life. Anyone who has taken a Greyhound at 2 in the morning knows the particular kind of loneliness that settles into your bones when the highway stretches out like a black ribbon under fluorescent rest stop lights. November 2012 found me making that exact trip from Philadelphia to somewhere in upstate New York, chasing a job interview that promised a fresh start after my engagement fell apart 3 months before what should have been my wedding day. My graduating class from college had already moved on to mortgages and babies, and there I was, 26 according to my driver's license, but feeling ancient, dragging a single suitcase and a heart full of desperate optimism onto a half-empty bus that smelled like diesel and someone's leftover fast food. The driver barely glanced at my ticket before waving me toward the back, where the overhead lights flickered with that sickly yellow glow that makes everyone look like they are recovering from something terrible. I picked a window seat about halfway down, pressed my forehead against the cold glass, and watched the Philadelphia skyline shrink into a smear of lights behind us. She got on at the Harrisburg stop, right around 3:30 in the morning when my eyelids had started to grow heavy, and the handful of other passengers had already surrendered to uncomfortable sleep. I noticed her immediately because she moved with this deliberate slowness, like someone who had all the time in the world and wanted you to know it. She was maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, and these pale blue eyes that seemed almost colorless under the dim bus lights. She wore a hand-knitted cardigan the color of dried roses and carried a large woven basket covered with a checkered cloth, the kind you see in old paintings of country picnics. When she stopped at my row and smiled down at me, I automatically pulled my bag from the empty seat beside me, the way you do when you are raised to be polite, even when every part of you just wants to be left alone. She settled in next to me with a soft sigh, arranging her basket on her lap with careful, almost ceremonial movements, and turned to face me with a warmth that felt rehearsed somehow, like she had practiced that exact smile in a mirror until it looked natural enough. Her name was Dorothy, she told me within the first 5 minutes, and she was heading to visit her grandson in Syracuse for his birthday. She asked me questions with this gentle persistence that made it hard to give short answers. Where was I going? What did I do for work? Did I have family waiting for me at the other end? I found myself telling her about the job interview, about the marketing position at a small firm that had seemed like a lifeline, when the email arrived in my inbox 2 weeks ago. She listened with her head tilted slightly to one side, making these small humming sounds of acknowledgement that grandmothers make when they want you to know they are paying attention. There was something almost hypnotic about talking to her in that dark bus, with the engine rumbling beneath us and the occasional flash of headlights from passing trucks illuminating her pale features. She patted my hand at one point and told me I seemed like a lovely young woman, that good things were surely coming my way, and I remember feeling this strange mixture of comfort and unease, like when a stranger stands just a little too close to you in an elevator. About an hour into our conversation, Dorothy lifted the checkered cloth from her basket and revealed rows of small pastries wrapped in wax paper, each one golden brown and glistening with what looked like honey glaze. She told me she had baked them for her grandson but had made far too many, that her eyes were always bigger than her kitchen could handle, and she laughed at her own joke with this tinkling sound that seemed too delicate for her age. She pressed one of the pastries into my hand before I could refuse, insisting that I looked hungry, that a young woman traveling alone at this hour needed something sweet to keep her spirits up. The pastry was still slightly warm somehow, which should have struck me as strange given that she had boarded the bus over an hour ago, but my stomach growled at the sight of it, and my brain was foggy from exhaustion. I took a bite to be polite, and the taste flooded my mouth. Honey and almonds and something else underneath, something floral and bitter that I could not quite identify. Dorothy watched me chew with an intensity that lasted just a second too long, before her face relaxed back into that practiced grandmotherly warmth, and she told me to finish it all, that I needed my strength for my big interview. The first wave hit me about 20 minutes later, this soft heaviness that started behind my eyes and slowly poured down through my skull like warm syrup. I thought it was just exhaustion finally catching up to me, the accumulated weight of sleepless nights spent crying over wedding deposits I would never get back, and apartments I could no longer afford on my own. My limbs began to feel distant, like they belonged to someone else and I was just borrowing them for the night. The window glass against my temple seemed to pulse with the vibration of the bus, and the passing lights on the highway started leaving long trails across my vision, streaking like comets in slow motion. I tried to sit up straighter, to shake off whatever was pulling me under, but my body refused to cooperate with the simple command. Dorothy's voice reached me through what felt like layers of cotton, asking if I was feeling all right, if perhaps I should rest my eyes for a little while. Her hand found my shoulder and guided me gently down until my head was resting against the seat back, and the last thing I saw clearly was her face hovering above me, that smile still fixed in place but her eyes now sharp and attentive, watching me the way a cat watches a bird with a broken wing. I do not know how long I drifted in that strange half-sleep, that place where you are aware of the world around you but cannot quite reach it. Sounds came to me distorted and fragmented, the rumble of the engine, the occasional cough from somewhere behind us, and beneath it all, a low murmuring that I slowly realized was Dorothy's voice. She was no longer speaking to me. I forced my eyes open just a crack, just enough to see through my lashes without alerting her that I was conscious, and I saw her leaning forward toward the aisle, her lips moving close to someone's ear. The driver. He had left his seat at some point. The bus must have stopped, though I had no memory of it, and he was crouched in the aisle beside Dorothy, his head bent toward hers like they were sharing secrets at a church social. I caught fragments of words, pieces of a conversation that made no sense to my drugged mind. The one, perfect age, service road past exit 47. The driver nodded once, twice, and then his eyes flicked toward me, just for a second, and in that moment I saw something that burned through the fog in my brain. He was not checking if I was comfortable, he was checking if I was unconscious enough. Panic is a strange thing when your body will not let you express it. My heart hammered against my ribs. I could feel it pounding like a fist trying to break through a locked door, but outwardly I remained still, limp, my breathing slow and shallow. The driver returned to his seat, and the bus lurched forward again, but something had changed. The smooth rhythm of the highway was gone, replaced by rougher roads, the occasional bump that made my head loll against the seat in a way that would have been painful if I could feel pain properly anymore. Through the window I could see that the lights had disappeared. No more passing trucks or distant farmhouses, just darkness pressing against the glass like a living thing. Dorothy hummed softly beside me, this tuneless melody that might have been a lullaby in another context, but here, in this moment, Sounded like something you would hear in a nightmare you cannot wake from. I tried to move my fingers, just a twitch, just something to prove to myself that I still existed inside this useless body. And after what felt like an eternity, I managed to curl my pinky finger against my palm. It was not much, but it was enough to tell me the drug was not as strong as they thought. Or maybe I had not eaten enough of that pastry. Or maybe pure terror was burning through the chemicals faster than they expected. The bus slowed and turned again, gravel crunching beneath the tires now, and I risked opening my eyes just a fraction wider. We were on some kind of service road, the pavement cracked and neglected, weeds pushing through the asphalt on either side. Up ahead, I could see a structure taking shape in the darkness, a building, low and sprawling, that might have been a warehouse or an old processing plant, the kind of place that dots the rural stretches between major cities like forgotten teeth in a rotting mouth. There were no lights in the windows, but I could make out vehicles parked near the entrance, 3 or 4 of them, and figures moving in the shadows near a loading dock. Dorothy shifted beside me and I let my eyes fall closed again, keeping my breathing steady, even as every instinct screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something. She leaned close to my ear and whispered that we were almost there, that everything was going to be fine, that I was going to meet some very nice people who had been waiting for someone just like me. Her breath smelled like peppermint and something sour underneath, and I realized with horrible clarity that she had done this before, probably dozens of times, riding buses through the night and selecting women who traveled alone, women who no one would miss until it was far too late. The bus groaned to a stop and the engine cut off, leaving behind a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Dorothy stood up, smoothing her cardigan with those careful hands, and called out something to the driver about helping her with the package. That word, package, hit me like ice water, cutting through the remaining fog with brutal efficiency. I was not a passenger to her, not a person, just cargo to be delivered and forgotten. Through my barely open eyes, I watched her step into the aisle and move toward the front of the bus, her woven basket left behind on the seat like a prop that had served its purpose. The driver was already outside. I could hear his footsteps on the gravel, and then voices. Male voices, at least 2 of them, speaking in low tones that I could not make out. This was my only chance. I knew it with a certainty that came from somewhere primal, somewhere beneath thought or reason. If I let them take me off this bus, if I let them get me inside that building, I would never see daylight again. My mother would spend years wondering what happened to her daughter, filing missing person reports that would go nowhere, holding on to hope that would slowly curdle into grief. I could not let that happen. I refused to let that happen. My body moved before my mind fully committed to the plan, some desperate survival instinct overriding the chemicals still sluggish in my blood. I forced myself upright, fighting through the vertigo that threatened to pull me back down, and my hand found my purse still wedged between the seat and the wall where I had left it hours ago. The window. I turned to face it, my fingers clumsy and uncooperative as I searched for the emergency latch that I knew had to be there somewhere. Greyhound buses have them. I remembered reading that somewhere. Little red handles that release the windows in case of accidents. The voices outside were getting louder. Someone laughed, and I heard Dorothy say something about the girl being small, easy to move. My fingers found the latch and I pulled with everything I had left, which was not much, but it was enough. The window popped outward with a sound that seemed deafening in the silence, and I did not think, did not hesitate, just pushed myself through the opening head first, tumbling out into the cold November air and hitting the ground hard enough to knock the breath from my lungs. Pain exploded through my shoulder and hip, but I was already scrambling, already crawling toward the darkness at the edge of the property where the weeds grew tall and the trees began. Someone shouted behind me, a man's voice sharp with surprise and anger, and I heard footsteps pounding on gravel, multiple sets of them converging on where I had landed. But I was already in the tall grass, my hands and knees tearing through dried stalks and thorny underbrush, moving on pure adrenaline, and the desperate knowledge that stopping meant death, or something worse than death. The drug still pulled at me, made every movement feel like I was swimming through syrup. But fear is its own kind of medicine, and mine was potent enough to keep me going. I reached the tree line and forced myself to my feet, using a trunk for support, and then I ran. I ran blindly through branches that whipped my face and roots that tried to catch my ankles. Ran until my lungs burned and my legs screamed for mercy. Ran until the shouts behind me grew distant and confused, spreading out as they searched in the wrong directions. I do not know how long I ran or how far. Time had become meaningless, measured only in heartbeats and ragged breaths. But eventually, I stumbled onto a paved road, a real road with faded yellow lines down the center, and I followed it with the last reserves of strength I possessed until I saw lights ahead, a gas station glowing like a beacon in the pre-dawn darkness. The attendant was a young man named Keith. I remember that because I made him tell me 3 times before I believed he was real, before I believed any of it was real. He found me collapsed against the ice machine outside, shaking and covered in dirt and dried blood from a dozen scratches I did not remember getting. He called the police while I sat in the back office wrapped in a blanket that smelled like motor oil and cigarettes, the most beautiful smells I had ever encountered, because they meant safety. They meant survival. The officers who arrived treated me with a skepticism that slowly transformed into horror as I described what had happened, as they drove me back along the route I had stumbled and found the service road, found the warehouse. It was empty by then, of course. Dorothy and the driver and whoever had been waiting for me had vanished like smoke, leaving behind only tire tracks and a single woven basket with a checkered cloth that tested positive for traces of Rohypnol. They never caught them, any of them. The bus company had no record of a driver matching the description I gave, and Dorothy, if that was even her name, existed nowhere in any database the FBI could access. Sometimes I wonder how many women she delivered before me, how many after, how many are still out there in the dark waiting for someone to come looking. I moved back in with my mother after that, took a job at a local bookstore, rebuilt my life one small piece at a time. But I have not taken a bus since that night, and I never will again. And every time I see an older woman with a basket, with that particular kind of grandmotherly smile, I cross to the other side of the street, and I do not look back. Driving for a rideshare app was supposed to be temporary, just something to help pay off student loans, while my actual career figured itself out. By the fall of 2017, my college graduation was already 2 years behind me, and the marketing degree I had worked so hard for sat collecting dust while I spent my nights picking up drunk college kids and businessmen who needed airport runs at ungodly hours. That particular Friday night started like any other. I had logged on around 9, hoping to catch the bar crowd and maybe squeeze in a few decent fares before calling it quits around 2 in the morning. The first few hours were uneventful, mostly short trips downtown, a couple heading to a concert venue, the usual. Around midnight, I pulled into a gas station parking lot off Route 34 to grab a coffee and check my phone. The app had been slow for about 20 minutes, and I was debating whether to just head home early. That is when the ping came through, and I remember staring at it longer than I should have. The pickup location was about 15 miles outside of town, way out on Miller Road where the streetlights stopped and the farmland started. The passenger had a 4.2 rating, which was not great but not terrible either. The destination field just said gas station, which was vague enough to make me hesitate. Everything in my gut told me to decline the ride. 15 miles out meant 15 miles back with no guarantee of another fare, and that stretch of road was nothing but cornfields and the occasional farmhouse with lights that always seemed to be off. But here is the thing about driving rideshare. Your acceptance rate matters. Too many declined rides and the algorithm starts punishing you, sending you fewer requests, pushing you down some invisible list. I had already skipped 2 rides earlier that night because of bad vibes, and I could not afford another hit. So I accepted the request, finished my coffee in 3 gulps, and started driving toward the kind of darkness that makes your headlights feel inadequate. The drive out to Miller Road took about 25 minutes, and with each mile the world seemed to shrink down to just my car and whatever the headlights could reach. No other vehicles, no houses with porch lights on, just flat stretches of farmland broken up by the occasional cluster of trees that looked like black smudges against the slightly less black sky. My GPS kept telling me to continue straight, and I remember thinking how strange it was that someone would request a ride from out here. There were no bars, no restaurants, nothing that would explain why a person would be stranded in this specific spot at nearly 1 in the morning. When I finally got close to the pickup location, I saw the car first. It was a dark sedan, maybe a Nissan or a Toyota, hard to tell in the darkness, pulled off onto the gravel shoulder with its hazard lights blinking orange. A man stood next to it, illuminated by my approaching headlights, and he raised one hand in a casual wave like we were old friends meeting up for lunch. I pulled up alongside him and lowered my passenger window. He was maybe 40, 45, with a receding hairline and a face that seemed ordinary in every way, the kind of face you would forget 5 minutes after seeing it. He wore a dark jacket over a flannel shirt, jeans, work boots, nothing remarkable. He leaned down to look into my car, and when he smiled, it seemed rehearsed, like he had practiced it in a mirror until it looked natural enough. He said his name was Dennis and pointed at his car, explaining that he had hit something in the road about an hour ago, and the tire went flat. No spare in the trunk, phone almost dead, so he had requested a ride to the nearest gas station to get help. It all sounded reasonable. Flat tires happen all the time. People get stranded on empty roads every single night. But something about the way he kept glancing back at his car, quick little looks like he was checking to make sure it was still there, made me wish I had trusted my earlier instinct and declined this ride when I had the chance. He climbed into the back seat, and immediately I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, something metallic underneath the stronger scent of sweat and what might have been gasoline. I figured he had been messing around with his car trying to fix the tire himself, maybe cut his hand on something, got some fuel on his clothes while checking under the hood. People smell like all kinds of things, and I had learned not to judge. I confirmed the destination on my app, a gas station about 12 miles east, and started driving. For the first few minutes, Dennis did not say much. He sat behind me, not directly behind the driver's seat, but off to the right where I could see him in the rearview mirror if I adjusted it slightly. He was looking out the window at the darkness passing by, his fingers tapping an irregular rhythm on his knee. When I tried to make small talk, asking if he lived around here, he gave me a vague answer about visiting a friend who had a farm nearby. I asked which farm, and he just said I probably would not know it. About 5 minutes into the drive, Dennis leaned forward slightly and asked if we could change the destination. He said his buddy actually lived closer to Ridgewood, which was a small town about 30 miles in the opposite direction from where we were heading. He said his buddy could come pick him up from there, that it would be easier than dealing with the gas station and a tow truck at this hour. I told him that was a pretty significant change, that it would add a lot to the fare, but he waved his hand like money was not a concern. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy, this casual dismissal of cost from a guy whose car did not even have a spare tire in the trunk. But I was already out here in the middle of nowhere, and a longer fare meant more money, so I updated the destination and took the next left onto County Road 9. That road was even darker than Miller Road, if that was possible, with trees pressing in close on both sides like walls. Dennis settled back into his seat, and I caught him checking his phone, the screen lighting up his face in brief flashes. He was not texting anyone. He was looking at a map. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept circling back to small details that did not add up. If his phone was almost dead like he had claimed, why was he using it to look at maps instead of conserving battery? Why change the destination so drastically after I had already started driving? And that smell, that faint copper undertone that I kept catching whenever he shifted in his seat, it was not going away. I adjusted my rearview mirror a few degrees, trying to get a better look at him without being obvious. That is when I noticed his hands. In the glow from a passing farm light, just a quick flash of illumination through the window, I saw that his knuckles were dark with something. It could have been grease, could have been dirt, could have been 100 things, but it did not look like grease. It looked wet. Dennis caught me looking in the mirror, and our eyes met for just a second. He smiled that same rehearsed smile and asked if everything was okay. I told him I was just checking for deer, that they like to jump out on roads like this. He nodded slowly and said that was smart, that a deer could really mess up your night. We drove in silence for another 10 minutes, and the further we got from the main road, the more my chest tightened with a feeling I could not name. Then my phone buzzed with a news alert, and I glanced down at the screen without thinking. Local stations had been pushing notifications all night about a concert and traffic delays, so I expected something routine. Instead, the headline made my foot ease off the gas pedal involuntarily. It said police were responding to a domestic disturbance on Franklin Farm Road, which was maybe 3 miles from where I had picked up Dennis. The article preview mentioned that a woman had called 911, but the call had been disconnected, and when officers arrived, they found signs of a struggle. No suspects, no additional details, investigation ongoing. I looked back up at the road, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Franklin Farm Road. Dennis had said he was visiting a friend on a farm nearby. He had been vague about which one, had changed the subject when I pressed. And now he wanted me to drive him 30 miles in the opposite direction, away from that area, away from whatever had happened in that farmhouse. My mind started racing through options, none of them good. I could not just stop the car and tell him to get out, not on a dark, empty road with no witnesses and no help for miles. I could not call 911 without him hearing me, and even if I could, what would I say? That my passenger had dirty hands and smelled funny? That he changed his destination? None of it was proof of anything. For all I knew, the news alert was a coincidence, and Dennis really was just some unlucky guy with a flat tire. But I did not believe that anymore. The rational part of my brain kept trying to come up with innocent explanations, but my body had already decided something was wrong. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I had to concentrate on keeping my breathing steady so he would not notice. I thought about my sister, about how she always told me this job was dangerous, how she worried every time I did late night shifts. I thought about how no one knew exactly where I was right now except for the app, and the app only showed our destination, not the isolated stretch of county road between here and there. Dennis spoke up suddenly, making me flinch. He asked if I could turn off the air conditioning because he was getting cold. I reached for the controls with a hand that I forced to stay steady, adjusting the temperature even though I had not even turned the AC on. It was October, and the heat was running low. He thanked me in that flat, polite voice and then asked another question, casual as anything. He wanted to know if I had been a ride-share driver for long. I told him about a year, keeping my answers short, trying not to let my voice crack. He said that was interesting, that he bet I met a lot of different people doing this job. I agreed that I did. Then he asked if I ever got scared, picking up strangers late at night in the middle of nowhere. The question hung in the air between us like smoke. I could see his face in the rearview mirror, half lit by the glow of the dashboard, and he was watching me with an expression I could not read. I told him no, that most people were just regular folks trying to get somewhere. He nodded slowly and said that was good, that fear could make people do stupid things. That is when I made my decision. About 2 miles ahead, I knew there was a 24-hour truck stop right off the highway exit, a place called Big Earl's that catered to long-haul drivers and always had at least a dozen rigs parked in its lot at any given hour. I had stopped there before for coffee on slow nights, and I remembered the bright fluorescent lights, the security cameras mounted on every corner, the constant flow of truckers coming and going. If I could get there, I would be surrounded by people and witnesses. I told Dennis I needed to stop for gas, that my tank was getting low and I did not want to risk running out on these back roads. I watched his reflection carefully as I said it, looking for any sign that he knew what I was really doing. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, just a tiny flicker of tension, But then he shrugged and said that was fine, that he was not in any particular hurry. The next 15 minutes felt like hours. Every time he moved in the back seat, every time he cleared his throat or shifted his weight, I expected something terrible to happen. I kept both hands on the wheel and my eyes fixed on the road ahead, counting down the miles in my head like a prayer. When the lights of Big Earl's finally appeared through the trees, I almost cried with relief. I pulled into the lot and parked right next to the entrance, under the brightest light I could find, surrounded by at least 8 or 9 parked trucks. I told Dennis I would just be a minute and got out of the car before he could respond, walking quickly toward the building without looking back. Inside, I went straight to the counter and asked the woman working there if I could use their phone, said mine had died. She gave me a strange look but handed over the store phone and I called 911. I told them everything. The pickup location near Franklin Farm Road, the news alert about the disturbance, the stains on his hands, the change in destination, all of it tumbling out in a rush. The dispatcher told me to stay inside and that officers were being sent to my location. I hung up and turned around to look through the window at my car. Dennis was gone. The back seat was empty, the door hanging open. I scanned the parking lot frantically, but there was no sign of him anywhere, like he had just dissolved into the darkness between the trucks. The police arrived about 12 minutes later, 2 squad cars with their lights flashing red and blue across the wet asphalt. I gave them my statement, described Dennis in as much detail as I could remember, told them about the car with hazard lights on Miller Road. One of the officers stepped away to make a radio call, and when he came back, his expression had changed into something harder and more serious. He told me that the disturbance on Franklin Farm Road had been upgraded to something worse. A woman named Constance Pruitt, 41 years old, had been found dead in her kitchen by responding officers. Her estranged husband, Dennis Pruitt, was wanted for questioning. The officer showed me a photo on his phone, a driver's license picture, and my stomach turned when I recognized those ordinary, forgettable features, that face I had been looking at in my rearview mirror for the past hour. They found his car on Miller Road, just like I said, and in the trunk, wrapped in a plastic tarp, they found a hunting knife and a woman's purse with Constance Pruitt's ID inside. He had been using my car to escape, to put distance between himself and what he had done to his wife, and I had almost driven him all the way to freedom. They caught Dennis Pruitt 3 days later at a bus station in New Jersey, trying to buy a ticket to somewhere far away. He was convicted of second-degree murder the following spring and sentenced to 25 years. I followed the trial from a distance, reading articles online but never attending in person. I could not bring myself to sit in that courtroom and look at him again. I quit driving for the rideshare app that same week and never went back. Took a job at a warehouse that paid less but let me sleep at night. Sometimes I still think about that ride, about how close I came to being another part of his story instead of just a witness to it. I think about how I almost ignored my instincts because I was worried about my acceptance rate, about an algorithm punishing me for being cautious. And I think about Constance Pruitt, about how her last moments were spent in her own kitchen with a man she had once trusted enough to marry. I never met her, never even saw a photo beyond what appeared in the news coverage, but I carry her with me somehow. Every time I get into a car with a stranger now, whether I am the driver or the passenger, I remember that ordinary faces can hide extraordinary darkness, and that sometimes the only thing standing between you and something terrible is the decision to trust your gut when it tells you to run. Friday afternoon hit different that week, and not in a good way. Both my parents had called within 10 minutes of each other, explaining they were stuck at work until late. Dad had some emergency at the warehouse, and Mom was covering for a coworker at the hospital who had gone home sick. It was just going to be me and my 2 siblings for dinner, and when Mom asked if I could handle making something, I jumped at the chance. 16 years old, and finally trusted with a real task, not just heating up leftovers or making sandwiches. My younger brother Elliot, who had just turned 13 the month before, would be home from basketball practice around 5:30. My sister Quinn was already upstairs doing homework, earbuds in, completely checked out from the world. I decided right then that I was going to make something impressive. Mom's garlic chicken stir-fry, the recipe she had been teaching me over the past few weeks. I wanted to prove that I could be relied on, that I was growing up, that they could trust me with more responsibility. Our house sat on a quiet street in Flagstaff, one of those older neighborhoods where everyone had lived for decades and knew each other by name. The kitchen was small but efficient, every inch of counter space serving a purpose. Mom kept her cooking equipment organized with almost military precision. Wooden spoons in the ceramic jar by the stove, knives on the magnetic strip, cutting boards stacked by size in the cabinet under the island. I pulled up the recipe on my phone and started gathering what I needed. Chicken breast from the fridge, vegetables from the crisper drawer, the big wok that hung on a hook above the stove. The rice cooker was already clean, sitting there waiting. Everything felt manageable, even easy. I remember tying on the old apron that hung by the pantry door, the green one with the coffee stains that Dad always joked made it look vintage. There was this warm feeling in my chest, this sense of pride that I was about to do something meaningful for my family. I had no idea that in less than an hour, that feeling would twist into something I still have trouble describing. The first mistake was deciding to rush. Elliot had texted that practice was ending early, which meant he would be home in 20 minutes instead of 45. I wanted everything to be ready when he walked through the door, wanted him to see me as capable and in charge. So instead of taking my time with the prep work, like Mom always emphasized, I started cutting corners. I grabbed the vegetables and began chopping them quickly, not bothering to wash the cutting board that had been sitting in the dish rack. The chicken went onto the counter without me checking if the surface was properly clean. I was moving fast, too fast, pulling out utensils and bowls and ingredients in a chaotic dance that would have made my mother cringe. The wok was heating on the stove, oil already starting to shimmer, and I still had half the prep work left to do. That frantic energy, that need to impress clouded every sensible thought in my head. I should have slowed down. I should have remembered that cooking is about patience, not speed. The glass measuring cup had been in our kitchen for as long as I could remember. It was one of those old Pyrex ones with the red measurement lines, the kind that feels indestructible until suddenly it is not. I needed to measure out the soy sauce and rice vinegar for the sauce, and I grabbed it from the cabinet without really looking. When I set it down on the counter a little too hard, I heard this sound. Not a crack exactly, more like a quiet ping, the kind of noise you almost convince yourself you imagined. I glanced at the cup and did not see anything obvious, no visible fracture or chip. So I poured in the soy sauce, then the vinegar, then the sesame oil, swirling it all together. It was only when I lifted the cup to pour the mixture into a small bowl that I noticed it. A thin sliver of glass, maybe half an inch long, sitting at the bottom of the dark liquid. My heart stuttered. I fished it out with my fingers, cutting my thumb slightly in the process, and stared at this tiny transparent shard that had almost made it into the sauce. Almost. But then a horrible thought crept in. What if there were more pieces that I could not see? I held the bowl up to the light, tilting it back and forth, searching for any glint or sparkle that might betray another fragment hiding in the dark liquid. The sauce was nearly black from the soy sauce, impossible to see through clearly. I told myself it was fine, that I had found the only piece, that glass does not just shatter into invisible dust. But my hands were not steady as I set the bowl down. The logical thing to do would have been to throw out the sauce and start over. We had more soy sauce, more vinegar, more of everything I needed. It would have taken 5 extra minutes, maybe less. But Elliot was going to be home any second, and Quinn would come downstairs expecting food, and I had already wasted time. The sauce looked fine. It smelled fine. I had removed the piece I found. In that moment, standing alone in the kitchen with the wok hissing behind me, I made a decision that I would regret for a very long time. I decided to use the sauce anyway. The cooking itself went smoothly, almost mockingly so. The The chicken sizzled perfectly when it hit the hot oil, turning golden brown in all the right places. The vegetables kept their crunch, their colors bright and appealing. When I poured the sauce over everything, it coated each piece beautifully, filling the kitchen with that familiar garlic and ginger smell that always made our house feel like home. I heard the front door open just as I was transferring everything to the big serving bowl, and Elliot's voice called out asking what smelled so good. Quinn came padding down the stairs a minute later, actually taking out her earbuds for once, drawn by the aroma. They both stood in the kitchen doorway looking impressed, and I felt this surge of pride that almost drowned out the gnawing anxiety in my gut. I served them each a plate, rice on one side, stir-fry piled high on the other. We sat down at the kitchen table together, and as I watched my brother and sister raise their forks, something cold and sharp settled in my chest. What had I done? Every single bite they took felt like a countdown to disaster. Elliot was shoveling food into his mouth the way 13-year-old boys do, barely chewing, talking between bites about some kid on his team who could not make a free throw to save his life. Quinn ate more slowly, scrolling through her phone with one hand, but she was still eating, still swallowing pieces of chicken and vegetables that might contain microscopic shards of glass. I pushed my own food around the plate, unable to bring myself to actually eat any of it. My appetite had vanished completely, replaced by this sick, twisting feeling that made my stomach clench every time I heard one of them chew. I kept waiting for something to happen. A sudden yelp of pain, a hand flying to a mouth, blood. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that everything was fine, that I was overreacting, that one tiny chip from a measuring cup could not possibly have contaminated an entire batch of sauce. But the other part, the part that would not shut up, kept reminding me that glass can slice through soft tissue like butter, that internal cuts can cause bleeding you cannot see until it is too late. Elliot asked me why I was not eating, and I had to come up with a lie on the spot. I told him I had been snacking while cooking and was not that hungry, which he accepted without question. Quinn did not even look up from her phone. They had no idea, no clue at all, that I was sitting there watching them like a hawk, scanning their faces for any sign of distress. Every time Elliot paused mid-chew, my heart lurched. Every time Quinn took a sip of water, I wondered if she was trying to wash down something sharp that had scraped her throat. The minutes stretched out like hours, each one filled with this unbearable tension that I could not release. I wanted to tell them to stop, to push their plates away, to spit out whatever was in their mouths. But how could I explain? How could I admit that I had been careless, that I had put speed and pride above their safety? The shame of it pressed down on me like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. So I sat there in silence, smiling when they complimented the food, dying a little inside with every word of praise. The meal ended without incident, but my nightmare was far from over. Elliot finished first, scraping his plate clean and asking if there was more. I told him no, that I had only made enough for one serving each, which was a lie. There was plenty left in the bowl on the counter. But I could not let him eat another bite. I could not let anyone eat another bite. Quinn finished a few minutes later and carried her plate to the sink, thanking me in that distracted way she had before heading back upstairs. Elliot flopped onto the couch and turned on the TV, completely oblivious to the war raging inside my head. I started cleaning up, moving mechanically, rinsing dishes and wiping counters while my mind spiraled through worst-case scenarios. I kept thinking about those medical shows my mom watched, the ones where patients came in with mysterious internal bleeding that nobody could explain. I thought about how glass fragments could lodge in the stomach lining, in the intestines, slicing slowly from the inside. Every medical horror story I had ever heard came flooding back, each one more terrifying than the last. I threw away the leftover stir-fry, all of it. I scraped the serving bowl into the trash and buried it under paper towels so nobody would see. The measuring cup went into the garbage too, wrapped in newspaper so the broken edge would not cut through the bag. I was destroying evidence, I realized, like some kind of criminal covering their tracks. But what else could I do? If I told the truth now, after they had already eaten, it would only cause panic without changing anything. The damage, if there was any damage, was already done. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom saying they would be home around 9:30, asking how dinner went. I typed back that everything was great, that the stir-fry turned out perfect, that Elliot and Quinn loved it. Each word felt like a betrayal. I was lying to everyone now. My siblings, my parents, myself, and the worst part was that I could not stop, because stopping meant admitting what I had done, and admitting what I had done meant facing the possibility that I had hurt the people I loved most in the world. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. I sat in the living room with Elliot, pretending to watch whatever show he had put on, but my eyes kept drifting to him every few seconds. I was watching for signs. A hand pressed to his stomach, a wince of discomfort, anything that might indicate something was wrong inside him. He seemed fine, laughing at the screen, completely relaxed. Upstairs, Quinn was quiet in her room, which was normal for her, but tonight every silence felt ominous. I made excuses to walk past her door, listening for any sounds of distress. Around 8:30, Elliot complained that his stomach felt weird, and I nearly came apart right there on the couch. I asked him what kind of weird, trying to keep my voice steady, and he shrugged and said he probably just ate too fast. Then he burped loudly and laughed about it, and the moment passed, But for those few seconds, I had been absolutely certain that this was it, that the glass had done its damage, that I was about to watch my little brother collapse in pain because of my stupid, selfish decision to cut corners. My parents came home just after 9, tired but cheerful, asking about dinner and praising me for stepping up. Mom hugged me and said she was proud, that this was a big step toward independence. Dad ruffled my hair and joked that maybe I could take over cooking duties permanently. I smiled and accepted their praise, feeling like the worst person alive. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound from Elliot's room next door, any indication that something was wrong. I kept my phone clutched in my hand, ready to call for help at the first sign of trouble. The guilt was suffocating, this thick black weight pressing down on my chest, making every breath feel earned. I had gambled with my family's safety because I was too embarrassed to admit a mistake, too proud to start over, too eager to impress. And now all I could do was wait and hope that I had not destroyed everything with one careless, cowardly choice. The next morning came slowly, gray light creeping through my blinds after what felt like an eternity of darkness. I heard Elliot's alarm go off through the wall, heard him shuffle to the bathroom, heard the toilet flush and the faucet run. Normal sounds. Living sounds. I got up and found Quinn already in the kitchen, pouring cereal, looking exactly the same as she always did on a Saturday morning. Elliot came downstairs a few minutes later, complaining about having to go to an early practice, but otherwise completely fine. No pain, no blood, no emergency. I watched them both eat breakfast, searching their faces one more time for any hint of suffering, and found nothing. The relief that washed over me was so intense I had to grip the counter to stay upright. They were okay. Somehow, impossibly, they were okay. The glass must not have made it into the food, or maybe there had only been that one piece after all. I would never know for certain, and that uncertainty would stay with me for a long time. But in that moment, standing in the morning light of our kitchen, I made a promise to myself. Never again would I let pride or embarrassment push me into a decision that could hurt someone I loved. I never told my family what happened that night. Part of me still thinks I should have, that they deserve to know the risk I put them in, even if nothing came of it. But the moment passed, and days turned into weeks, and eventually it felt too late to bring it up. What I did do was change. I became almost obsessive about kitchen safety after that, checking equipment before using it, taking my time with prep work, never rushing no matter how much pressure I felt. My mom noticed and commented once that I had become quite the careful cook. I just smiled and said I was trying to do things right. She had no idea how much weight those words carried. Sometimes late at night I still think about that Friday evening. I think about how close I came to causing real harm, how a split-second decision to stay quiet could have ended with my brother or sister in a hospital bed. The fear has faded now, mostly, but the lesson remains burned into my memory like a scar. Some mistakes you can take back, others you carry forever, even when you get lucky enough to walk away without consequences. Finding affordable housing in Denver had become my personal nightmare long before I met the person who would turn my actual life into one. My graduating class from college in 2015 had scattered across the country chasing careers, but I stayed behind working retail management at a sporting goods store, watching rent prices climb every single year while my paycheck stayed flat. By the spring of 2023, my landlord announced he was selling the duplex where I had lived for 4 years, and suddenly I had 60 days to find somewhere new. Every apartment I toured wanted first month, last month, security deposit, and proof of income at 3 times the rent. My savings account had maybe $2,000 in it. My parents lived in Arizona on a fixed income and could not help. I started looking at shared housing situations out of pure desperation, scrolling through listings late at night after closing shifts, hoping to find something that would not drain every dollar I earned. The ad for the house on Sycamore Drive seemed almost too good. A 3-bedroom place where one tenant had just moved out, leaving a furnished room available for $600 a month, utilities included. The current resident was a guy named Darren Whitfield, who described himself as quiet, clean, and respectful of boundaries. I messaged him on a Saturday morning and he responded within minutes, inviting me to come see the place that afternoon. When I pulled up, the house looked decent enough from the outside. A small single story with beige siding, a chain-link fence around a patchy yard. Nothing fancy, but nothing falling apart either. Darren answered the door wearing khaki pants and a plain blue polo shirt, his brown hair neatly combed, his handshake firm but not aggressive. He spoke softly, almost too softly, and I remember leaning in slightly to hear him as he showed me around the kitchen and living room. Everything was tidy. He asked about my job, nodded politely at my answers, and mentioned he worked remotely doing data entry for an insurance company. When I asked about a background check or lease agreement, he waved his hand and said the landlord was pretty relaxed about that stuff, just needed rent on the first of each month in cash or Venmo. I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded paperwork. But $600 a month with utilities and a move-in date of next week. I signed nothing, shook his hand, and told him I would bring my stuff over the following Friday. The first 2 weeks were fine, even pleasant. Darren kept to himself mostly, spending long hours in his room with the door closed, and when we crossed paths in the kitchen or hallway, he would give me a small nod or ask how my day went in that same quiet voice. I started to think I had lucked out. My bedroom was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out onto the backyard and a lock on the door that actually worked. I bought a mini fridge so I would not have to share the main one, set up my laptop on the desk Darren had left in the room, and started to settle into a routine. Work, home, dinner, sleep, repeat. Sometimes I would hear Darren talking in his room late at night, and I assumed he was on the phone with family or maybe playing some kind of online game with voice chat. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the murmur of his voice but not the actual words. It did not bother me. I wore earplugs to sleep anyway because of traffic noise from the main road 2 blocks over. Everything seemed normal, and I remember texting my friend Corinne that I had finally caught a break on the housing situation. The first strange thing happened on a Wednesday night about 3 weeks after I moved in. I came home from a closing shift around 11, exhausted and looking forward to crashing immediately, and found the back door standing wide open. Not just unlocked, fully open. The screen door pushed out against its hinges, letting in the cool night air and a few moths that had gathered around the porch light. I walked through the house calling for Darren, but his bedroom door was closed and no sound came from inside. I shut and locked the back door, checked the windows, and stood in the kitchen for a long moment trying to figure out what had happened. When I knocked on Darren's door to ask if he had left it open, He answered after almost a full minute, his hair messy like he had been sleeping, blinking at me with this confused expression. He said he had been in his room since 7 and had not touched the back door. His voice was calm, almost too calm, like he was reciting something he had rehearsed. I told myself that maybe I had not locked it properly when I left that morning, that the wind could have pushed it open, that there had to be a reasonable explanation. I went to bed but kept my own door locked, and I did not sleep well that night, listening for sounds in the hallway that never came. After that night, I started paying closer attention to things around the house, and that is when I began noticing details that I had previously overlooked or dismissed. My toothbrush would be in a different spot on the bathroom counter than where I had left it. A jacket I always hung on the back of my desk chair ended up draped across my bed. One morning, I found my wallet sitting on the kitchen table even though I distinctly remembered leaving it on my nightstand before falling asleep. Small things, the kind of stuff you can easily convince yourself you imagined or forgot about. But they kept happening, 2 or 3 times a week, and each time I felt this creeping sensation that someone had been in my space while I was gone or asleep. I bought a cheap doorstop from a hardware store and started jamming it under my bedroom door at night in addition to locking it. I also started taking photos of how I left things before work, my desk, my dresser, the position of items on my shelf, so I could compare when I got home. The photos confirmed what I suspected. Things were being moved. Not dramatically, not obviously, just enough that I could tell. When I brought it up to Darren over dinner one evening, asking if he had been in my room for any reason, he looked at me with this blank expression and said no. Why would he go in my room? That would be a violation of my privacy. The way he said the word violation made something tighten in my chest. The late night talking from Darren's room got worse around the same time. What I had assumed was phone calls or gaming turned into something else entirely. I would wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning to the sound of his voice rising and falling through the wall. Sometimes calm and measured, sometimes sharp and angry, but always just one voice. No pauses for someone else to respond on a phone. No notification sounds or ringtones. Just Darren speaking in complete sentences to nobody I could hear, sometimes for an hour or more. One night I pressed my ear against the wall separating our rooms and listened, trying to make out the words. Most of it was too muffled, but I caught fragments. Something about being watched. Something about trust. A name I did not recognize repeated over and over. Then suddenly the talking stopped mid-sentence, and I heard footsteps cross his room toward the wall where I was listening. I pulled back and held my breath. The footsteps stopped. Neither of us moved. After what felt like 5 minutes but was probably 30 seconds, I heard him walk back to his bed, and the springs creaked as he lay down. I did not sleep the rest of that night. I just sat on my bed with the lights off, watching my door, wondering what kind of person I had moved in with and why I was still there. The strangers started showing up in early June. The first one came on a Sunday afternoon while I was doing laundry in the garage. I heard the doorbell, then voices in the living room, and when I came inside, I found Darren talking to a heavyset man in a stained gray hoodie who I had never seen before. They both went silent when I walked in. Darren introduced him as an old friend from high school, but the man did not offer his name or shake my hand, just stared at me with these flat, empty eyes until I excused myself and went back to my room. He was gone an hour later, and Darren never mentioned him again. Over the following weeks, there were others. A woman with bleached blonde hair and scabs on her arms who arrived at midnight and left before sunrise. A skinny kid who could not have been older than 19, pacing on the front porch and smoking cigarettes until Darren let him in. An older guy with a neck tattoo who showed up 3 different times and always went straight to Darren's room with a backpack that looked full when he arrived and empty when he left. I never learned any of their names. I never saw money exchange hands, but I knew what I was probably looking at, and it terrified me to think about what Darren might be involved in, what might be happening in the room next to mine, while I tried to pretend everything was fine. I should have left. I know that now, and I knew it then, but every time I opened my laptop to search for new apartments, I saw the same impossible numbers that had driven me to Sycamore Drive in the first place. First month, last month, security deposit, application fees, credit checks. My savings had not grown since moving in. If anything, unexpected car repairs and a root canal had drained them further. I calculated what it would take to move into even the cheapest studio apartment in Denver, and came up short by at least $800. My credit score was not great after some mistakes in my early 20s, which meant most landlords would reject my application anyway. I thought about asking Corinne if I could crash on her couch, but she lived in a one-bedroom with her boyfriend, and I could not impose on them like that. I thought about calling my parents, but the shame of admitting I had made such a stupid decision, moving in with a stranger without any paperwork or background check, kept me from picking up the phone. So I stayed. I told myself I would save aggressively for 2 months, build up enough cushion to get out, and in the meantime I would just keep my head down and avoid Darren as much as possible. I installed a security camera app on an old phone and positioned it on my bookshelf facing my door, set to record whenever it detected motion. I bought a heavy-duty lock for my bedroom door and installed it myself one afternoon while Darren was out. I thought these precautions would be enough. I thought I could manage the situation until I had the money to escape. I was wrong about that too. The night everything changed started like any other Friday. I came home from work around 9, heated up leftover Chinese food, and went straight to my room to avoid any interaction with Darren. I could hear him moving around the kitchen, cabinets opening and closing, the faucet running, normal domestic sounds that should have been comforting but now made me tense. Around 11, I turned off my lights and got into bed, wedging the doorstop under the door, and checking that my phone was charged in case I needed to call for help. I fell asleep faster than usual, exhausted from a brutal week of inventory at the store. What woke me was not a sound but a sensation, a change in the air, a presence, something primitive in my brain screaming that I was not alone. I opened my eyes, and in the thin light bleeding through my curtains, I saw my bedroom door standing open. The doorstop was on the floor 3 feet away. The heavy-duty lock I had installed myself, the one that required a key from the outside, was hanging loose from the frame, the screws ripped out of the wood, and standing in my doorway perfectly still was Darren. He was just watching me. Not moving, not speaking, just standing there in boxer shorts and a white undershirt, his arms hanging limp at his sides, his face completely expressionless in the shadows. I do not know how long he had been there before I woke up. I do not know what he had been doing or planning to do. I sat up and said his name, trying to keep my voice steady, and he tilted his head slightly like a dog hearing a strange noise. Then he turned and walked back down the hallway to his room without a single word. I did not go back to sleep. I sat in my bed with every light on, my phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over the emergency call button, waiting for something else to happen. When the sun came up, I packed a bag with everything important: laptop, documents, medications, a few changes of clothes, and left it by my window in case I needed to escape quickly. I knew I should call the police, but what would I even say? My roommate stood in my doorway. He had not touched me, had not threatened me verbally, had not taken anything. I could already imagine the dispatcher's voice, polite but dismissive, telling me there was nothing they could do about a weird roommate. So instead, I called in sick to work and spent the day at a coffee shop, researching my options. Tenant rights, restraining orders, emergency shelters, anything that might help me get out. The information blurred together on my screen. Most resources assumed you had a lease, which I did not. Most advice assumed you had somewhere else to go, which I did not. I texted Corinne and told her something was wrong with my living situation, without giving details. She offered to let me stay for a night or two if things got really bad, but I could hear the hesitation in her voice even through text. I told her I would figure it out. I told myself the same thing. Around 6 in the evening, I drove back to Sycamore Drive because I had nowhere else to go, and because all my stuff was still there, and because some stubborn part of me refused to believe that the quiet, polite man who had shown me around the house 2 months earlier could actually be dangerous. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a car I did not recognize parked on the street in front of the house. A beat-up red sedan with tinted windows and a cracked tail light. The front door was unlocked when I tried it, which was unusual because Darren was obsessive about keeping it locked during the day. I stepped inside and heard voices coming from the kitchen, loud and agitated, multiple people talking over each other. I should have turned around right then. I should have gotten back in my car and driven to Corinne's place and never looked back. But my bag was still in my room by the window, and my laptop had all my work files, and I convinced myself I could just slip down the hallway and grab my things without anyone noticing. I made it about 5 steps before Darren appeared at the end of the hall, blocking my path to my bedroom. Behind him I could see 2 men I had never met before, one of them holding what looked like a small handgun down by his thigh. Darren's face was different now, not blank or confused but sharp, focused. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my legs feel weak. He asked me where I had been all day. He asked me if I had talked to anyone about him. He asked me what I had told Corinne in my text messages. The fact that he knew her name, that he had been reading my messages somehow, sent a wave of nausea through my stomach. I told him I was just grabbing some things and leaving for good, that I would not cause any trouble, that I did not care what he was doing and would never tell anyone. He stared at me for a long moment, then stepped aside and gestured toward my room. I walked past him on shaking legs, feeling his eyes on my back the whole way. I grabbed my bag from beside the window and stuffed a few more things inside. Chargers, my passport, a framed photo of my parents that I could not leave behind. My hands were clumsy and slow, fumbling with zippers that suddenly seemed impossible to operate. I could hear Darren and the 2 men talking in low voices in the kitchen, occasional words drifting down the hall. Money, shipment, problem, deal with it. I did not want to know what they were discussing. I just wanted to get out alive. I slung the bag over my shoulder, took one last look at the room that had been my home for 2 months, and walked back down the hallway toward the front door. Darren was waiting there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching me approach. When I reached for the door handle, he put his hand on my arm, not hard, but firm enough to stop me. He leaned close and spoke directly into my ear, his breath warm against my skin, and said that if I ever mentioned this house or his name or anything I had seen to anyone, he would find me. He said he knew where my parents lived in Arizona. He said he had copied all the contacts from my phone one night while I slept. Then he let go of my arm, opened the door for me like a gentleman, and wished me luck finding a new place. I walked to my car without looking back. I drove to Corinne's apartment and sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could stop shaking enough to go inside. I never went back to Sycamore Drive. I never reported Darren to the police because I was terrified of what he might do if I did. I stayed on Corinne's couch for 3 weeks until I found a room in a house with 2 women who insisted on background checks and a formal lease and references from previous landlords. I paid the extra fees gladly. I filled out every form they asked for. And sometimes late at night when I cannot sleep, I think about the other people who might have answered Darren's ad after I left, who might have seen that cheap rent and that tidy house and that soft-spoken man and made the same desperate choice I did. I hope they were smarter than me. I hope they asked the questions I did not ask. But mostly I just hope they got out too. Co-workers used to joke that I walked faster than anyone they knew. Born and raised in Chicago, class of 2014, you learn to move through the city with purpose, or you become an easy target. That Tuesday night in September 2023, I had stayed late finishing inventory at the bookstore where I worked as assistant manager. The L would have been the smart choice, but the apartment was only a 20-minute walk from the shop. And after 8 hours surrounded by fluorescent lights and dusty shelves, I wanted the night air. The streets in Lincoln Park are generally safe, well lit for the most part, full of young professionals walking their dogs and couples heading home from dinner. I had made this walk hundreds of times without incident. Grabbed the jacket, locked the front door, and started down the familiar route I could have navigated blindfolded. The first 10 minutes were completely unremarkable. I passed the Thai place on the corner that always smelled like lemongrass, nodded at the bartender smoking outside Murphy's pub, watched a group of college kids stumble out of an Uber laughing about something on one of their phones. Normal Tuesday night stuff. The temperature had dropped since afternoon, and I pulled the jacket tighter, thinking about the leftover pasta waiting in the fridge and the new episode of that true crime podcast everyone at work kept recommending. I turned onto Waverly Street, a quieter stretch lined with brownstones and old oak trees. Halfway down the block, I noticed a man sitting alone on one of the wooden benches near the small community garden. He appeared to be in his 50s, wearing a dark green jacket and khaki pants, hunched forward with his face illuminated by the glow of a phone screen. I made a mental note of him the way you do when you are a woman walking alone at night, then shifted the path slightly toward the curb to give him space as I passed. "Excuse me, miss?" His voice was polite, almost apologetic. I kept walking, pretending not to hear, which is the standard protocol drilled into every woman since childhood. Do not engage, do not stop, keep moving. But then he added, "Please, I just need help with something on this phone. The screen is too dark and these old eyes cannot make out the letters." I slowed down against every instinct screaming at me to continue. He sounded frustrated, helpless even, like someone's grandfather struggling with technology. I glanced back and saw him squinting at the device, holding it at arm's length the way older people do when they cannot find their reading glasses. The streetlight above him was flickering weakly, casting his face in intermittent shadow. Against all the rules I had internalized over the years, I felt a pang of guilt for ignoring him. What if he genuinely needed directions? What if there was an emergency and he could not read an important message? I stopped about 8 feet away from the bench, keeping what felt like a safe distance. "What do you need help with?" The words left my mouth before I could reconsider. He looked up with an expression of genuine relief, smile lines crinkling around his eyes. He had a weathered face, the kind that suggested years of outdoor work, and gray hair cropped short beneath a faded baseball cap. "Oh, thank you so much," he said, gesturing at the phone. "This thing keeps asking me to verify something and I cannot read what it says. The font is so small these days, you know. Everything is designed for young people with perfect vision." He let out a small laugh that seemed self-deprecating and harmless. I took a few steps closer, still maintaining some distance, craning my neck to see the screen from where I stood. The phone displayed some kind of login page with tiny text. "It says, 'Enter your verification code,'" I told him. "There should be a text message with a number." "A text message?" He frowned at the screen, then started scrolling slowly with his index finger. "How do I get to those? Is that the little envelope icon?" He angled the phone toward me, and I found myself leaning in slightly to get a better look. "No, that one there," I said, pointing without thinking. "The green one with the white bubble." He fumbled with the screen, tapping the wrong app twice before finally opening messages. The whole interaction felt painfully slow, the way helping a parent or grandparent navigate a smartphone always does. Part of me wanted to just grab the phone and do it myself, but I kept that boundary intact. He scrolled through what appeared to be a nearly empty inbox, squinting and bringing the screen closer to his face. "I think it might be this one," he muttered. "Can you see the numbers? There are too many of them and I cannot tell which ones to type in." He shifted on the bench, moving toward the edge closest to me, shrinking the gap between us by another foot or two. Something in the air changed then, though I could not have explained what. Maybe it was how smoothly he had repositioned himself, or how his questions kept requiring me to look more closely at the screen rather than at the surroundings. I became suddenly aware of how quiet Waverly Street had gotten. The brownstones on either side were dark, their residents already asleep or watching television in back rooms. No cars had passed in at least 2 minutes. The Thai restaurant and Murphy's pub felt very far away now, separated from me by several blocks and one poorly lit stretch of sidewalk. I took a small step backward, ready to give him a quick answer and continue on my way. "The code is 647321, I said, reading it off quickly. Just type those numbers into the box and hit the green button." I was about to wish him a good night when I heard footsteps behind me. Not approaching from the distance, not walking past on the street. Close, right there, like someone had been standing still and just now decided to move. I turned my head and saw a second figure standing maybe 6 feet away, positioned directly between me and the main road I had come from. A woman, or what I initially thought was a woman, wearing an oversized hoodie with the hood pulled up and dark jeans that blended into the shadows. The face beneath the hood was young, maybe early 20s, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that held no expression whatsoever. She was not looking at the man on the bench. She was looking at me, studying me the way you might examine produce at a grocery store, deciding if it was worth taking home. There was no pretense of coincidence, no fake surprise at finding another person on this quiet street. She had clearly emerged from the narrow alley between two brownstones, an alley I had walked past without a second glance. The realization hit me like ice water down the spine. She had been waiting there, in the dark, watching the entire interaction unfold, waiting for the exact moment when the man on the bench had my full attention, when I was distracted and vulnerable and perfectly positioned with my back to the only escape route. The man on the bench stood up slowly. The helpless grandfather routine evaporated like morning fog, replaced by something deliberate and controlled. He slipped the phone into his jacket pocket without looking at it. Those same eyes that had seemed friendly moments ago, now flat and calculating. He was taller than I expected, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that his hunched posture had concealed. "You should not walk alone this late," he said, and his voice had changed too. Deeper, steadier, no more fumbling uncertainty. The woman in the hoodie took a step closer, not rushing, just calmly reducing the distance. I was caught in a shrinking triangle, the bench at my back, the woman blocking the path to the main street, and a wall of hedges from the community garden cutting off any lateral escape. Every self-defense class I had ever taken, every article I had read about trusting your instincts, every warning from friends and family about being careful at night, all of it screamed the same thing. This was planned. This was coordinated. And I had walked directly into it because I felt guilty about ignoring a stranger. The next few seconds stretched into something elastic and surreal. The man took a step toward me, and the woman mirrored his movement from the opposite direction. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them rushed. They moved with the patience of people who had done this before, who knew that panic makes victims freeze or run in predictable patterns. I felt the scream building in my throat but forced it down, knowing that a scream on this empty street might not bring help fast enough. Instead, I did the only thing my body would allow. I ran directly at the hedge. It was a wild, desperate calculation. The bushes were thick but not impenetrable, maybe 4 feet tall, bordering the community garden that I knew opened onto Addison Avenue on the other side. I heard the woman curse behind me as I crashed into the branches, thorns tearing at my jacket and scratching my face, my hands pushing through leaves and woody stems with strength I did not know I possessed. Something grabbed at my ankle, fingers or a branch. I could not tell, but I kicked backward hard and felt it release. I tumbled through the other side of the hedge and landed on my hands and knees in the soft dirt of the garden. Tomato cages and bean trellises surrounded me like skeletal sentinels in the darkness. I scrambled upright and ran between the raised beds, knocking over a wheelbarrow with a crash that echoed through the night. Behind me, I heard them pushing through the hedge, slower than I had been, maybe hesitant to follow into an open space with multiple exits. I did not look back. I reached the chain-link fence on the far side, climbed it in 3 desperate movements that left my palms bleeding from the wire, and dropped onto the sidewalk of Addison Avenue. A car was coming, headlights bright in the darkness, and I ran directly into the street waving my arms like a person possessed. The driver slammed on the brakes, horn blaring, and I was already at the passenger window pounding on the glass before the car fully stopped. Middle-aged woman stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. "Please," I said, and my voice came out cracked and breathless. "Please, there are people chasing me. Call 911, please." The woman, whose name I later learned was Candace, did not hesitate. She unlocked the doors and told me to get in while she dialed emergency services with shaking fingers. I collapsed into the passenger seat and locked the door immediately, my chest heaving, blood dripping from the scratches on my face onto her beige upholstery. Through the windshield, I watched the entrance to the community garden, expecting to see two figures emerge at any moment. But the seconds ticked by and no one appeared. They had vanished back into the shadows of Waverly Street, swallowed by the same darkness that had hidden them in the first place. The police arrived within 7 minutes, 2 squad cars with lights flashing, and I gave my statement while sitting on the curb wrapped in a shock blanket that one of the officers had retrieved from his trunk. I described the man in detail, the green jacket, the baseball cap, the weathered face. I described the woman in the hoodie, her sharp cheekbones, her empty stare. The officers exchanged glances when I mentioned the coordination between them, the way they had positioned themselves to cut off my escape. "Sounds like a team," one of them said quietly to his partner, as if this was something they had heard before. The detectives who contacted me the following week told me I was lucky. They had been tracking a pattern of similar incidents in the area over the past several months, always targeting women walking alone at night, always using the same technique of distraction and encirclement. 2 other victims had not been as fortunate as me. They would not give me details and I did not ask for them. I moved to a different neighborhood before the month ended, broke my lease and paid the penalty without complaint. For a long time afterward, I could not walk anywhere after sunset without my heart racing, and my eyes scanning every bench, every alley, every shadow that seemed too still. I take ride shares now, even for short distances. I do not care about the cost. Sometimes I think about that moment when I stopped walking, when I let guilt override every survival instinct I had ever developed. How close I came to becoming another statistic, another name in a police file, another cautionary tale told to women who just want to walk home in peace. The man with the phone is still out there somewhere, I assume, sitting on another bench in another quiet neighborhood, waiting for another woman to make the same mistake I almost made. And that thought keeps me awake more nights than I would like to admit. A stretch of empty highway late at night isn't usually where people expect anything meaningful to happen, but for me, it had become a second home. At that time in my life, I was juggling long shifts with the roadside assistance company while trying to save enough to move into a place that wasn't a shared basement apartment. Nights were quieter, paid a little better, and honestly gave me space to think. So when my work phone buzzed with a service request around 1:40 a.m., I didn't hesitate. The location was a long, forgotten segment of highway about 40 minutes from town. No streetlights, barely any signage, the kind of place where the darkness presses against the windows. I didn't bother calling dispatch to say I was heading out. I just grabbed the keys, threw on my jacket, and told myself it would be a quick tire change or a dead battery, nothing more. The road swallowed my headlights as I drove, and the temperature outside kept dipping lower than the forecast said it would. I remember noticing that the asphalt looked almost wet, even though it hadn't rained, like it was holding on to the cold. About 10 minutes from the pin on the GPS, I spotted a dim red glow on the shoulder, hazard lights pulsing weakly. At first, I didn't see anyone standing outside the vehicle, which struck me as strange given how cold it was. When I slowed down and rolled to a stop behind the car, 2 shapes finally came into view. One person leaning against the passenger side door, and another standing just a little too close to them. The man nearest the car had on a light denim jacket and kept one hand tucked into the pocket in a way that didn't match the weather. The driver, a woman maybe in her early 30s, held herself unnaturally still, like she was waiting for permission to speak. Stepping out of my truck, I called out a quick greeting, trying to sound casual. The man answered before the driver even lifted her head. He introduced himself as someone who just stopped to help and insisted everything was under control. His voice had this forced cheerfulness that didn't match his expression. His jaw was clenched tight, and he kept his eyes on me as if calculating something. The driver finally looked up, but only for a second, and it was the briefest glance. just enough for me to notice the way her hand twitched near her thigh. When the man shifted his stance, she made the smallest motion behind his back, a quick flick of her fingers toward me, almost like she was signaling without wanting him to see. It was so subtle I almost doubted I'd seen it. Trying to assess the situation, I walked closer and asked the driver if she'd requested assistance. The man answered again, louder this time, saying she had a flat tire and he was just about to take care of it. The woman didn't contradict him, but her shoulders tightened, and she pressed her lips together like she was bracing for something. Up close, I noticed her keys were still in the ignition, engine running, heat barely on. People with car trouble don't usually leave their engines running with strangers around. When I crouched near the back to check the tire, she made another tiny gesture, 2 quick taps against her leg, then a slow shake of her head. I felt a wave of unease that was hard to put into words, the kind that comes when your instincts start yelling long before your brain catches up. I stood up slowly, realizing I might have walked into something far more dangerous than a routine service call. I needed to buy myself a little time without tipping him off, so I pretended to focus on the tire, even though it was obvious the problem wasn't mechanical. The lug nuts looked untouched, and there were no punctures or bulges, nothing that would have triggered a service call. When I stood up again, the man had moved closer, not enough to seem aggressive, but enough to let me know he was tracking every move I made. He kept his feet angled toward me, like he was ready to cut off whatever direction I might choose. The woman kept her gaze lowered, but every so often her eyes flicked up toward me with this desperate urgency, the kind you recognize instantly, even if no one says a word. It hit me then that coming out here alone without notifying dispatch had been a real mistake, one I couldn't undo now. I asked the man directly how long he'd been there, hoping to read his reaction. His answer came too fast, like he'd rehearsed it. "Just a few minutes," he said, though the condensation on his jacket sleeve suggested otherwise. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "She seemed nervous out here by herself." His eyes didn't match the tone he was trying to use. They were sharp, alert, watching for any shift in my posture. The woman swallowed hard and adjusted her coat with tiny, shaky movements. I could see a set of shallow scratches on her left wrist, thin and recent. When the man noticed me looking, he slid subtly to block my line of sight. That was the moment I stopped pretending this was anything normal. I stepped toward my truck under the excuse of grabbing tools, hoping to discreetly hit the emergency button on my radio. But halfway there, I heard gravel shift behind me. He'd followed, staying just close enough to make sure he could see what I was doing. My truck's cab light flicked on when I opened the door, and that seemed to agitate him. His voice dropped, no friendliness left in it, and he said, "No need for all that, I told you. We've got everything handled." That phrasing made it clear he wasn't talking about the car anymore. I kept my body angled so I could see him through the corner of my vision, trying to act like I was simply sorting through equipment. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to be careful, to not escalate anything unless I had no choice. Before I could figure out my next move, the woman spoke for the first time. Her voice was thin but steady, like she'd finally decided the risk of staying silent was worse than whatever might happen if she pushed back. "Could you please check the trunk?" she asked me, emphasizing the words in a way that didn't fit the question. The man whipped his head toward her, surprise breaking through whatever mask he'd been holding on to. That brief reaction told me everything. She wasn't asking about a spare tire. She was trying to carve out an opportunity, any opportunity, for one of us to break whatever hold he had on the situation. My pulse hammered as I realized every second I hesitated was another second she stayed trapped beside someone who clearly wasn't there to help her. The trunk request gave me a narrow opening, so I nodded and walked toward the back of the car. The man hesitated before following, and that hesitation alone told me he didn't want me near it. The woman stepped slightly to the side, positioning herself closer to my truck than before, like she was aligning her escape route in advance. As I reached the trunk, I deliberately slowed down, pretending to fumble with the latch while angling my body so I could see both of them in the reflection of the rear window. The man hovered behind me, too close again, arms stiff at his sides. "There's nothing back there," he insisted. but there was a sharpness to his voice now, a raw edge that replaced his earlier forced calm. I lifted the trunk anyway, even though I expected resistance. To my surprise, he allowed it, but his jaw tightened like he was waiting for a reason to intervene. Inside the trunk, everything was too clean. No tools, no luggage, not even a spare tire. A total empty shell except for a single bright blue windbreaker folded neatly in the corner. Most people driving that late at night have something back there. Jumper cables, old blankets, grocery bags, anything. The emptiness itself felt wrong. When I turned back toward the woman, she made a small motion with her elbow toward the man, almost like she was trying to tell me without words that the danger wasn't in the trunk at all. It was the person standing beside her. Her breathing had shifted, quiet but uneven, like she was trying to hold herself together. That was when I realized she'd positioned herself just a few steps from my truck's passenger door. She was calculating too. The man suddenly stepped between us and slammed the trunk shut with more force than necessary. "I told you, there's nothing there," he said, tone sharper now. The hollow thud echoed across the empty highway. He squared his shoulders toward me, and there was no attempt at friendliness left, no pretense. His eyes were locked on mine, and the tension rolling off him felt heavy enough to cut through the cold night air. I made sure my hands stayed visible and raised them slightly, not in surrender, but in a way that signaled I wasn't looking for trouble. Behind him, the woman shifted her weight from one foot to the other, ready for a cue, either from me or from whatever unpredictable move he might make next. I knew I had one shot to get both of us out of there without something irreversible happening. My radio wasn't an option with him shadowing my every move, and my phone was buried in my jacket, so I spoke clearly, forcing a steadiness into my voice I wasn't fully feeling. "I need to run a quick verification with the service log," I said. "Company requirement." It was a lie, one he didn't know enough about my job to challenge immediately. Before he could respond, I called out to the woman, "Can you hand me your ID real quick?" Emphasizing hand me in a way I hoped she'd catch. She reacted instantly, stepping toward my truck instead of toward me. The man realized what was happening half a second too late and lunged, not at her, but at me, as if stopping me was the only thing that mattered. That split second became the only window she needed. She yanked open my truck's passenger door and dove inside, slamming it shut just as the man's shoulder collided with mine. The impact wasn't enough to knock me over, but it forced me a step back, and that tiny bit of space became my advantage. I didn't swing or shove him. I just moved out of his reach, putting the length of the truck between us. He rounded the front like he planned to block her in, but she was faster. I heard the click of the lock button, and then the metallic thud of her sliding across the seat to grab the driver's side latch from inside. I threw myself toward the door before he could reach it, and by pure luck we pulled at opposite sides of the handle at the same time. The door cracked open just wide enough for me to wedge my shoulder in and slip into the cab. She shoved my keys into my hand with this urgent determination, like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. The man grabbed the doorframe before I could pull it shut, his fingers hooking over the metal. His face was inches from the gap, expression stripped down to something cold and deliberate. He didn't say a word, not a threat, not a demand, just stared at us like we'd interrupted something he fully intended to finish. I turned the key in the ignition with one hand and used my other forearm to force the door inward, pinning his fingers between the frame and the hinge. He jerked back with a sharp grunt, and that was the only break we needed. I slammed the door shut, threw the truck into drive, and hit the gas so hard the tires skidded before catching traction. The woman pressed herself against the seat, breathing hard, her eyes darting back toward the shrinking figure on the roadside as the headlights stretched his shadow across the asphalt. We didn't speak for a full minute. The highway ahead felt endless, the kind of straight dark road where distance has no meaning. Her hands were clenched around the fabric of that bright blue windbreaker from the trunk, a detail I hadn't even seen her grab. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled only on the first word. She told me she'd pulled over because her engine light came on, and the man had arrived almost immediately, too quickly to be coincidence. He'd insisted on helping, then taken her keys straight from the ignition before she could react. Every attempt she made to step away from him had been met with a firmer tone, a closer stance, a quiet pressure that kept her from running. She hadn't known what he wanted, only that he wasn't letting her leave. Her gestures toward me were the only signals she thought she could risk. I drove her straight to the nearest gas station with lights and security cameras, not stopping until we were in a place that felt safe enough for both of us to breathe normally again. From there, she called a relative to pick her up. I stayed with her until they arrived, then reported everything to dispatch and the county sheriff. When officers checked the location an hour later, neither the man nor her car was there. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing except a small patch of disturbed gravel where we'd struggled at the door. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he planned to do, and I still think about the fact that I almost showed up too late. But one thing became crystal clear that night. Instincts aren't guesses, they're warnings, and ignoring them on a deserted highway in the middle of the night could have ended in a way neither of us could come back from. That night has stayed with me in a way I never expected, maybe because life felt so steady back then. I was living alone for the first time in a small apartment near a row of old brick buildings, where the hallways always carried this faint smell of dust and warm paper, like an old library that never quite aired out. I'd been juggling work, errands, and the occasional swipe through a dating app just to remind myself I wasn't turning into a hermit. That's where I met a guy named Evan, at least that was the name he used. His profile showed him outdoors a lot, usually with a baseball cap and a big grin, the kind that made him look approachable without trying too hard. We chatted for a few days, nothing deep, but enough that meeting him didn't feel reckless at the time. He pushed a bit harder than I expected when it came to picking me up. I suggested meeting at the cafe, but he replied right away saying he'd rather take care of the driving, adding a winking emoji that I tried to interpret as playful, not controlling. I hesitated, fingers hovering above my phone, but eventually agreed because I didn't want to come across as paranoid. When he pulled up, the car was spotless in a way that didn't match the slightly messy vibe he'd given off online. He stepped out wearing a dark green jacket with scuffed elbows and greeted me with a laugh that came out too loud for the quiet street, like he'd practiced sounding relaxed and overshot the landing. Still, dinner itself was fine. Not great, not terrible. He talked a lot, mostly about his job in consulting, though every time I asked what exactly that meant, he changed the angle of the conversation. When we got back to my building, he parked and immediately got out, saying he'd walk me to my door. I thanked him but said it wasn't necessary. It wasn't even late, and I lived in a pretty safe area. The shift in his face was instant, like someone clicking a switch behind his eyes. He didn't argue, just nodded once with this stiff-clipped motion and got back into the car. He didn't wave, didn't say goodnight, just pulled away with this slow, crawling roll that made me stand there pretending to check my purse so I wouldn't have to watch him drive off. Inside my apartment, I tried to shake it off by making tea and watching something dumb on my laptop, but the whole interaction kept replaying in my head, especially the way he shut down the second I declined his offer. A few hours later, I opened the app again out of curiosity, maybe to reassure myself I hadn't imagined the weirdness. His profile was gone, not unmatched, not blocked, but vanished completely. The more I thought about his pictures, the more details stopped lining up. One photo that looked like a campsite suddenly seemed like a stock image. The hiking picture had a backdrop I'd swear I'd seen online before. Even the age he listed didn't match the tiny lines I'd noticed near his eyes in the restaurant. It felt like realizing I'd gone on a date with a cardboard cutout, something shaped like a person but hollow once you looked too close. At the time, it just left me unsettled, nothing more. I couldn't have guessed the night still had one last turn waiting for me. Later that night, the building was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that makes every small noise stand out like it's being amplified. I couldn't sleep, so I left the living room lamp on and curled up on the couch scrolling through mindless videos just to distract myself. Every so often, the pipes in the wall let out these metallic pops, normal for the building, but they kept making me glance toward the hallway that led to my front door. Around midnight, something made me get up and walk to the peephole. It wasn't a noise exactly, more like the sense that the quiet had changed shape. When I looked through, the hallway was empty, but there was a faint shadow stretching across the floor, as if someone stood just outside the narrow field of view. I blinked hard, stepped back, and then leaned in again, but the shadow stayed, unmoving. My first instinct was to rationalize it. Maybe the light in the hallway was flickering, or maybe there was something leaning against the opposite wall casting that shape. I stood there arguing with myself in whispers, telling my brain to stop jumping to conclusions, but my body wouldn't move away from the door. Then I noticed something else. The air felt warmer near the peephole, like someone on the other side was standing close enough for their body heat to bleed through the wood. I rested my palm against the door for just a second and felt a faint vibration, rhythmic and subtle, like breathing. That's when the realization sank in that whoever or whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were waiting. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the door. My apartment wasn't big, but suddenly it felt too open, with every lamp casting long, strange shadows across the walls. I reached for my phone, debating whether I should call someone, my friend Marina maybe, or even the building's security desk. But the idea of saying it out loud made me feel ridiculous. I hadn't seen a face. I hadn't heard footsteps, just a shadow and warmth. I kept trying to convince myself I was overreacting to a bad date and a worse vibe. Still, I turned off the TV and stood in silence, listening to every creak of the old building like it was a message. That's when the doorknob moved. It didn't rattle or jerk like in movies. It rotated slowly, deliberate enough that I heard each tiny shift of metal, like someone testing it with patience. Like they already knew I lived alone and wanted to see if I'd forgotten to lock the deadbolt. I felt my breath catch, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, instinctive way, like my body was bracing for something it didn't want to name. I took 2 steps back, then 3, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers tingled. The knob never turned all the way, but it moved just enough to prove that what I'd felt wasn't imagination. Someone was standing at my door, trying to get in as calmly as if they had all night to try. The sound stopped as suddenly as it began, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before, almost like it had weight to it. I kept staring at the door, expecting the knob to turn again, but nothing happened. I waited a full minute before tiptoeing back toward the peephole, moving slowly enough that the floorboards wouldn't betray me. When I pressed my eye against the tiny glass, the hallway looked normal again. Empty still, lit by that tired yellow bulb overhead. But the shadow I'd seen earlier wasn't there anymore. The air around the door didn't feel warm either. Everything looked so plain that I started wondering if my mind had stitched the whole thing together out of leftover anxiety from the date. I almost convinced myself of that, right up until I noticed the faintest echo of a shoe print right at the edge of my doormat, like someone had been shifting their weight back and forth while waiting. I backed away from the door and sat on the floor with my knees pulled up, trying to steady myself. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Hi, a man I went on one mediocre date with might be lurking outside my home, except I can't prove it? It sounded absurd. And yet the unease rising through me didn't feel absurd. It felt precise, like every instinct I had was pointing toward the same conclusion. I wasn't imagining anything. I checked the windows next, drawing the curtains tighter even though I lived on the 3rd floor and no one could reach them from outside. Then, I turned off the lamp in the living room, leaving only the soft glow from the kitchen nightlight. The dimness made shadows pool in the corners, but I felt less exposed with the lights low. I tried lying down on the couch, thinking sleep might take the edge off, but every sound made my eyes snap open. A distant elevator ding, the creak of another tenant's door. Even the hum of the refrigerator sounded sharper. Sometime around 1:30, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway, slow, evenly spaced, like someone pacing rather than heading toward a specific unit. They paused near my door, paused long enough that I covered my mouth with both hands to keep my breathing quiet. Then the steps continued a few paces and stopped again, right near the stairwell. Whoever it was didn't go down the stairs or toward the elevator. They just stood there, listening, waiting. The presence felt intentional, like I was the only reason they were lingering on my floor at all. I stayed frozen on the couch until the footsteps eventually faded, but I didn't dare check the peephole again. My phone battery hovered at 12%, and I kept it clutched in my hand just in case. Every scenario I could think of flashed through my mind, each one worse than the last. I kept replaying the shift in Evan's face when I refused to let him walk me to my door. The stiffness in his posture, the sudden quiet, the way he pulled away without a single word. All those strange gaps in his stories at dinner had felt mildly annoying at the time. Now they stacked together like mismatched puzzle pieces, forming a picture I didn't want to look at directly. Whoever he really was, he hadn't disappeared from that app because he got bored. Something about the timing made my skin prickle in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. By the time 3 a.m. crawled around, exhaustion started pulling at me, but I was too keyed up to close my eyes for more than a few seconds. I decided to sit at the small dining table facing the door, telling myself that keeping the door in sight would make me feel more in control. It didn't. Every so often a faint thud came from somewhere in the building, pipes settling, a neighbor shifting in bed. Normal stuff. But in my head each noise stretched into something deliberate. I kept thinking about how close he'd been earlier, close enough for his breath to warm the wood. The thought settled under my ribs like a weight. I kept rehearsing what I'd do if he tried the doorknob again, but every version of the plan fell apart somewhere in the middle. Around sunrise, the hallway finally brightened as the motion-sensitive lights flicked to a cooler white. I hesitated for a good 10 minutes before checking the peephole again. This time, the hallway was completely clear, no shadows, no stray noises, nothing suggesting someone had been standing there hours earlier trying to slip inside. A tiny part of me wondered if I'd overreacted after all, until I noticed a small piece of folded paper tucked under the corner of my door. My stomach tightened immediately. I stared at it through the peephole for so long that my vision blurred. When I finally cracked the door open just enough to pull it inside, the hallway remained silent. The paper wasn't a note, not exactly, just a printed screenshot of a map with a blue pin dropped over my building. No message, no handwriting, just that. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't change clothes. I just grabbed my keys and left the apartment, locking everything behind me with shaking fingers. I drove straight to a coworker's place across town, someone I trusted enough not to question me when I showed up pale and wide-eyed on her doorstep. We sat in her tiny kitchen while I told her everything, every detail I could remember about the date, the hallway, the doorknob. She listened quietly, then insisted I call the police. I did, and the officer who came later that morning walked through my apartment, checked the hallway camera, and took a statement. The camera had a blind spot right by my door, just a few inches where someone could stand without being seen. The officer said they'd look into it, but I could tell by his tone he thought I'd just had a frightening night and nothing more. I didn't go back to that apartment for 3 days. When I finally did, I brought 2 friends with me. Nothing had been disturbed. No more papers under the door, no strange sounds, but that screenshot sat heavy in my thoughts. It was too intentional, too pointed to be random. I ended my lease 2 months early and moved to a different building across the river, someplace with brighter hallways and cameras that didn't leave blind spots. I changed numbers, deleted the dating app, and spent weeks wondering how much of the person I'd met was even real. What scared me most wasn't that he'd lied about his photos or his job. It was that he'd wanted to walk me to my door. He wanted to know exactly where I lived. Looking back now, I still don't know what would have happened if I hadn't locked the deadbolt that night. Maybe nothing. Or maybe everything that kept me awake afterward, the footsteps, the warmth at the door, the map, would have led somewhere much darker. All I know is that the moment that doorknob turned, something in me changed permanently. I trust my instincts now, even when they don't make sense to anyone else. Especially then. Whatever he was planning, it stopped at that locked door. And that's enough closure for me, even if the rest of it never makes sense.